Shall we get underway, please? Thank you, Mr. Murray. Good morning. Welcome to the Audit Risk Finance meeting. Congratulations, Team New Zealand. As we go through, we have received an apology from Ian Barker and acknowledge the cause of his not being here with a family bereavement. No other apologies. Everybody is here. Could somebody please move that we accept the apology? Thank you, Councillor Delberg. Thank you, Mr. Murray. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Confirmation of order of business. There's no change to the order of business, so we'll proceed as per the agenda. Interests. Haven't been notified of any changes, but are there any updates to the interest register or any conflicts with any item on the agenda? There are none. Thank you. We have not been advised of any public forum, so we'll move to confirmation of the minutes of the 18th of May. Are there any changes, amendments to those minutes? If not, would somebody move that they be accepted as a true record, confirm them as a true record of the meeting? Thank you, Councillor Tolberg. Seconded. Thank you, Your Worship. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Move to the status report, page 16. And the first item on the status report relates to the tendering processes. As mentioned there, 2 further strands of work will occur on that, and I have an appointment to meet to discuss this later this week with the acting chief executive. So we'll treat it as an ongoing carried forward until that's achieved. The second item on the status report was in relation to the public forum raised by Mr. Steve Cross to the Governance Committee, I think at the 9th of March, and there is a report on this agenda, so we'll take that at that point. Tax risk governance framework, another item referred to this committee from the subcommittee from the Governance Committee, and we're advised that a report will be coming to us on the 8th of September, the next Audit Risk and Finance meeting. So that remains ongoing. Just by way of information, people may or may not recall at the last meeting, I asked for 2 reports at various times during the meeting. One was in relation to the risks associated with the cyber attack, the WannaCry that was happening, and what actions were being taken. Could we be assured there was safety in that? And the second item was following the release of the water report in Hawke's Bay, whether there was any elements of that were relevant to us here in Nelson for learnings. They didn't appear on the status report because we didn't move them as a motion, which is something we'll need to do, but I was pleased to see that reports on both of those items were produced, I think by Mr. Laverdis and Mr. Ball respectively, and they were emailed, I think, to all members of the committee, indicating that there was a satisfying response to both of those items. So are there any further discussion on the status report? If not, would somebody move that we receive the status report? Thank you, Mr. Murray. Thank you, Councillor Delberg. Any further debate? Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Chairperson's report. I don't have a formal report for this meeting, but certainly like to acknowledge David Hammond being here as the acting chief executive, and look forward to working with you, David, during the course of your stay here as this committee. So, thank you. And we'll move to the corporate report. Over to you.
Through the Chair, the corporate report to the 30th of April highlights that for the period of the 10-month period, there's a 4.1 million favourable surplus to budget, and notes that capital expenditure is 13.1 million under budget, and noting that 9.6 of this has been actually carried forward through exception reporting. I'm happy to take any questions in relation to the report or the attachments.
Thank you, Nikki. Questions for the Group Manager? Mr. Murray?
Thank you, through the Chair. I have a couple of questions, if I may. I suppose there's a wee bit of a philosophical feeling coming out of here when I read on page 24 that fees and charges are more than budget. That's fine. However, marina income is under by 132,000. Okay, and there's another reference in here to forestry being ahead as well somewhere. But it just sort of made me think and ponder. We have all of these little wee operating accounts, sort of business type accounts like forestry, marina, hard stand, and I just wonder if we should give some thought to a committee somewhere having a look at the P&Ls that are the actual profit and losses that are happening within those operating type accounts. So when it came up in here, I just sort of pondered that, because it is concerning the marina income is under by 132,000. It is concerning that that's relating to the hard stand. I know we purchased that bit of land. We had to get the business as well, but it's the sort of thing that just puts a wee flag up the flagpole for me, and I wonder what else is sort of sitting in there in those other little wee P&L. So that's more of a comment to ponder, I think, more than anything. But then I read, and again, it might even fit into the same sort of category. It's the Tahuna Motor Camp is 115k ahead of budget, and that's a wee bit further down the page. And that flagged up again the same sort of issue. But then I sort of wondered, how did we actually miss not invoicing that in 14-15? And then I sort of started to ponder, well, how do we know that we're getting all of our income recorded when we should be if we've missed something like that coming through? And I was sort of thinking around the wider issues of festivals, camp, library, everything, And I was pondering that question in relation to the internal audit plan, which we're going to discuss later in the meeting, and perhaps there's a wee bit of connection between that question and when we talk about the internal audit plan. But I just sort of was sitting here thinking about, well, how do I know as a governor that all of the income is being accounted for on a timely basis, especially when I see a comment like that? So that's another sort of comment to ponder, I think, more than anything.
Did you want to see if Sharon has a response to that in terms of either the practicality of
yes,
looking at that at a P&L level, or inclusion in IA internal audit or something?
Yes,
Nikki,
I'm happy, but I presume the rest of the committee would like to hear a response to that. Yep.
Through the Chair, I mean, in terms of a committee looking at these in a bit more detail, I would assume it would be this committee, given it's got the delegations for those sort of activities, and certainly there's no issue with bringing that forward. I mean, we are looking at the hard stand revenue. We did take a bit of it was a bit of an estimate of what that would be, and we do need to look at what those we are actually going through and doing a detailed P&L at the moment for the hard stand to actually understand whether we have got the fees right for that activity. So that's certainly been raised. But yes, there certainly can be a linkage to the internal audit plan. I know, in terms of the areas that have been issues, so we were as you will be aware, we've had issues with the property team previously. We were under-resourced, and we've addressed that, and so that was one of the reasons that that amount wasn't invoiced. But we are working on processes and so that things are checked off and invoiced in a property system, so that we've actually got that extra control in there.
Thank you. Mr. Murray, do you want to put a motion that gets that onto the status report?
No, I wasn't intending to pass a motion at this stage. However, I'm happy for the advice of the committee to ponder that question for me. I didn't actually get to that point. I just was raising in my mind these various questions. I didn't quite get to that point of is it something that is a motion?
Just that from my understanding of process, if we want to be able to look forward to receiving that as a requested item to come to this committee, the best way of achieving that is to have something in the form of a motion that will then go onto the status report that we can monitor when and how that comes back. I'll be guided by the rest of the committee. Do we want to see something on that? Any comments on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think you'd need to formulate what it was that you were asking. So just to be quite clear what it was that was being requested. So maybe if Mr. Murray could just frame up some words around that, we can consider it. Or Miss Harrison may have some suggestions as well.
Thank you. I mean, before we do that, we need to receive the report, and then we can raise matters of debate around it. Of course, I've been reminded of that process. So,
happy to move we receive the report.
thank you, Madam Mayor. Seconder for that. Councillor Dahlberg, thank you. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. You can.
Okay, well, I had a couple of other questions, but perhaps if I just...
We can follow up with the questions. I just wondered if we wanted to finish off with that item. Does Ms Hughes want to join the table on that? Is that what you... Thank you.
Okay, perhaps the resolution is something along that profit and loss accounts for the forestry, marina, camping grounds, consolidated, be brought to a future meeting. I think at this stage, that's what I had in my sights, but there could be others.
So we have that as a motion. Somebody second that? Thank you, Councillor Dahlberg. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against?
Thank you. Then on page 25, I note that we've got a $573,000 overspend in the School of Music strengthening project, and again I'm not 100% sure where the approval process for that overspend sits or where it was, so or if it is indeed an overspend or a timing difference. So just a wee bit of clarification around that.
Through the chair, I'll speak to that. So basically, the School of Music Council are contributing $3 million to that project. And effectively it has been phased across this current financial year and next financial year, so it really is just a timing issue, and we are actually going to do some sort of square up with the School of Music at the year end. So there will be some sort of potential bring forward, because we agreed that the cleanest way for us to do it is to actually be banker for the whole transaction and to pay the first $3 million, and then they start to pay us back after that point in time.
Thank you.
So it's just simply phasing.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, Mr Murray? Any other questions from other members of the subcommittee? No. We've received and passed that report, so we'll move to item 9, the balance sheet reconciliation, and I presume this is you, Tracy. Thank you. Well, trying to locate her papers. Thank you. Are there any comments or changes that you wish to make in introducing that report, or over to you?
Through the chair, good morning. No real comments or changes. This is very much a visibility exercise for you. There are no major changes to what we saw last year. There's no unusual movements that I need to draw your attention to, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Tracy. Mr. Murray.
Thank you. Thank you. Tracy, I enjoyed this report. I always write on it. I'm not sure why we get it, but it always makes me smile because balance sheet reconciliations, we know, happen all the time. Anyway, a couple of quick questions in the detail, if I may. On page 36, about a third of the way down, we've got an account there called Go Shift Central Initiative, and it says the reconciliation required, yes, and then you've got NR, not required. But everything else is either yes, no, but that one's an NR. So I don't know what Go Shift Initiative is and why it's an NR.
Through the chair, the Go Shift initiative is, I believe, related to the building activity, and we are acting as coordinator, I think is probably the right word, for the whole country or those that are currently involved in this initiative. So it's purely a kind of a money in, money out arrangement, and it's administered by the building team.
So surely we would check our balance to what we think we owe?
Through the chair, we check the balance with the building team. Yes.
Okay, thank you. And on that same page, we've got the, and this is just a wee bit for explanation, we've got the fisheries outfall, and it's got about 79,000, and we've also got another one up there called Top of the South Marine Biosecurity Partnership, of which we call them clearing accounts 4035 and 4043 annual balance. What does that mean? Same thing, clearing account, it's just money in, money out?
Through the chair, that's correct, yes.
Interesting. Okay, and finally, if I may, on page 38, we have a whole lot of loans here, and there's, I sort of just looked at one. We've got loans CHWH non-current, about 1.3 million, which I assume is a loan to somebody. So the question is, who's that? And then I see up above there's an annual loan valuation adjustment, which I'm not sure what that is. So I just was looking for a wee bit of an explanation of how this sort of all runs in here. And then it went on to a further question of, how do we know that if we've got these loans sitting here and they're identified, that we're actually complying with the loan conditions and agreements, and that actually is what it should be?
Through the chair, in this particular case, CHWH is Clean Heat Warm Homes. These are loans that are owed to us by the community. And the item at the top of the page, the valuation adjustment, is the annual revaluation that we are required to do. So that will be updated again at the end of June. They are reconciled, at least, not sure if it's annually or monthly in those cases, to make sure that they are what we expect them to be according to our records.
So what would cause that? What would cause that annual loan adjustment then that you're talking about? I mean, a loan's a loan, isn't it?
Interest rates, I believe. So we revalued current interest rates at the end of the financial year.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
probably not really, not too sure if it's for our committee here, but that Theatre Royal non-current, there were some discussions around, are these all like structured loans, so we know who's got them and how they're getting paid back? They seem to me, I'm just talking of history, tells me when I go to these AGMs of these groups, I don't seem to get a lot of structure coming back at me. So my question would be, if we're looking at those there, I'm thinking you've got that's one I'm thinking there. Do we actually have a structured loan arrangement with paybacks and all that sort of stuff, which I think leads into their other councils? Because I did pick up there also, there was some changes in some of the ratings where we end up with, that's when I picked up the interest rate changes and they get a different bill going out on their rates. I picked that up, but I wasn't too sure about these here. Could someone explain to me where we are?
Thank you, Councillor Dahlberg. I think Mr Ward has come to the table to do that.
So I can talk through the chair to the specifics of the Theatre Royal loan. That matter has been brought to council previously, and council decided it wanted to have a workshop on the issue to discuss the structure of that loan and its and how it's going to look and be serviced moving forward. That workshop will take place in August.
I think that'll help, and we'll get more information there, I'm assuming. Thanks.
That's the intention of the workshop, as I understand it. Okay. Any further questions? Madam Mayor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, I think it would be helpful if we could just get a very quick story, in a sense, if you were trying to explain to a member of the public how our balance sheet works in relation to our CCTOs in particular. Can I get the sort of précis story of how they show on our balance sheet? So if I'm looking at, for instance, Nelson Airport Limited, and I can see an investment showing there for 1.2 million, an investment book. Can I just get Tracy, how you would describe to somebody how our CCTOs in particular appear on our balance sheet? What do we see?
Through the chair, that they only show on our balance sheet as an investment if we have recognised an investment in terms of cash or other assets. Our other CCOs get consolidated in our annual report, but are not part of our balance sheet.
Through you, Mr. Chair, so talk me through the one for the airport. So what are we seeing when we see the airport on this balance sheet? Do we know?
Through the chair, as I say, it's purely the investment at the time of the guiding arrangement of the ownership of the airport.
So it's a historic
Yes, it does.
recognition, which is why it's so low, essentially.
Just let me remind myself exactly how much it is.
Mr. Chair, if I could, the reason I'm asking is just in the sense of actually telling the story around our balance sheet. So we talk about ourselves as a sort of $1.3 billion enterprise, and I just want to have some sort of how somebody would look at that and what would they see. When we say that, what do we mean?
Through the chair, to answer your previous question, yes, that's exactly right. It's very, very historical. If you looked in the annual report, you would see a much different number.
And presumably that question gets confused because we have a 50% ownership of the airport, which makes the accounting treatment in the books different to Nelmac, for instance, where we own 100% of it, which we consolidate on a equity type basis or a line by line basis. So that investment is more valued at what we put in plus its accumulated surpluses in theory, whereas the airport appears to be just straight out what we put in to start it up, and could well be more value or less value depending on how you look at it.
Does that,
It does, but I think what we have to do, I think we have a piece of work to do here, just in terms of, it is the telling of the story of if you're a ratepayer, or of Nelson, and we talk about Nelson City Council as a $1.3 billion enterprise. What does that really mean? So what is in public? What is ultimately in public ownership here, and what does that look like in the whole council family? So if we're looking at the consolidation of our entire, asset base, our shareholdings, the rest of it, what does that look like, and how would you see that? And it's something that if I probably go and pull bits of the annual report and other things, I can try and explain that story. But I actually think it would be useful to have a few paragraphs if I, for instance, if I'm having to present our financial story in a way that is, most people will get to grips with that. So it's not necessarily something for the meeting, it's just that when you start to look at the balance sheet and you start to look at the numbers, you can become somewhat confused about what that whole picture looks like, because you're only seeing a slice at in this case at a point in time, rather than actually the reality of the value of the public assets.
so, Madam Mayor, have you got a thought about where you would like those few paragraphs to be? Is that something that you would expect to see in an annual report?
I don't know if it's in the annual report, but I just think it's if the officers could just take on board my desire to have a script that describes who we are in terms of our shareholding, our asset base, and who we are, that actually from a council or elected perspective, or communicating to the public, we can say, well, actually this is, if you're talking about this enterprise, this is what it looks like. It's I'm just conscious that it's quite hard to translate this into something that actually describes who we are in the broader sense.
Understood. So are you wanting do you want to request an action in some form from officers
I
on
don't
that?
think I need to, Mr. Chair. I think that will probably action its way through.
So any further questions for Tracy? Councillor Walker.
Thank you. On page 36, under your current liabilities, just a couple of small queries. Unclaimed monies reserved is $14,000. What is that figure? How's that arrived at? What sort of item is it?
Through the chair, that is where refunds are due to our ratepayers, and we are trying our hardest to get it back to them, but for various reasons we are being stymied.
Okay.
People move or...
Yep. Thank you. And in a similar vein, I see we've got election deposits there of $1,400 haven't gone back. Is that people not claimed them? Do we not know who those people are so we can clear that out of the system?
Through the chair, I'd have to look at that reconciliation myself to give you the answer to that, but I know that there is a time frame wherein they have to be repaid, so we'll follow that up.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hughes. Thank you, Councillor Walker. Any further questions on the balance sheet reconciliation? If not, would somebody move we receive that report and its attachment? Mr. Murray, thank you. Councillor Delberg, thank you. Is there any further debate on that? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you, Ms. Hughes. Liability Management Policy Review, item 10.
Through the chair, the liability management policy has been on an annual review timetable. We have looked at this recently with our Treasury advisors and have recommended some changes required. They're discussed in section 4 of the discussion document, and probably one of the more material changes is around section 4.6, which would allow officers to undertake interest rate swaps out to 15 years without having to come to council for approval. I mean, it's I must say this is really driven by the fact that the Local Government Funding Agency have issued quite long dated bonds out to 2033, which is pretty amazing really, and very good for the local government sector that we have access to those sort of terms, given our long-term investment in infrastructure. I think it's really important. So that's a real positive for us. Whether or not we will be issuing swaps out to that term, I have a bit of a question mark about, because I think there's certainly some liquidity swap, the swap market in New Zealand out past 10 years isn't actually that liquid. So, but this just gives us the opportunity, if we do long dated bonds, to actually hedge it correctly. And I'm happy to take any questions on these amendments which are covered in the attachment.
Thank you, Nikki. Questions? Mr. Murray?
I'm happy to go second in the queue, Mr. Peters, if that's appropriate.
Yours was the first hand up and the only hand up at this point
Okay.
that I've recognised, so
Okay, thank you.
go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So a couple of questions. In the document, and this is probably to just to help my understanding a little bit better about these things, but we refer to collars, which is a new term, and that's on specifically on page 48 and also on the document. And also you talk about any fixed rate hedge, and I just wondered when you say a collar, what does that mean? And when you say a fixed rate hedge, what does that mean?
Through the chair, I think so. The collar isn't a new term. It has been in there. It's just that it's been inserted in the table. A collar is really and I think what you're alluding to is the fact that we need to introduce a glossary of terms so that it is clear what all these products are, and we have actually got a document for that. A collar really is around a type of swap that kind of has limits at both ends. It effectively locks, I always think of it like it locks you on both ends and locks that risk into a certain range. And a fixed rate hedge really is a swap or something that locks in you at a fixed rate as opposed to having floating rate risk. So that effectively is what we run in our treasury book, a mixture of floating rate risk and fixed rate risk. So we do lock in quite a portion of our risk as fixed rate.
Okay, so they're your hedging mechanisms.
Yeah,
Yes.
effectively.
Okay, cool. That's what I thought it would be. So that's awesome. I just want to come back and ask you about this 15-year bond. And I'm okay saying that I'm okay to move to that policy. But I'm reflective that I'm okay at the moment because we're in a low interest rate environment, and perhaps if I was, a low interest rate environment which predictably, because nothing stays down forever in this market, is going to go up into the future. So that could only give us benefit at the moment if we're looking at interest rates going up in the future. If we were in a different position and we were, say, sitting at 10, 11, 12% interest rates, and we're saying, well, the long-term forecast is less than that and they're going down, I don't know if I'd be so comfortable about that 15-year approval thing. And so that sort of drew me into, well, is that something that needs to be reviewed within the policy every cycle or couple of years, that term? Because while I'm comfortable with it now, I may not be comfortable with it in 5 years' time, is I suppose the point where I'm getting to. And that's the sort of thing I think is a reviewable point in the policy, which sort of comes back to is when do we next see the policy again, which I presume is annually. So could I have some comment around that?
Ms. Harrison?
Through the chair, the It is proposed that this policy is reviewed annually with our Treasury advisors, but that the actual review date would be every 3 years. And that if there was anything material that came up in the interim, that we would bring it back on an annual basis. I just think having these policies coming up every year is not particularly helpful, because we end up just wordsmithing it. Obviously, if the interest rate markets change, we would be bringing it back in a shorter time frame. I think the reality is, on an individual basis, you are tactical about what you hedge back to fixed rate and what you don't, and I think it's more driven by our fixed rate maturity profile limits. So we actually have within this policy, under the section how interest rate risk is managed, we would never hedge 100% of any debt that was greater than 5 years anyway, because we do want to have some exposure to the floating rates. So yeah, so it wouldn't be like everything that you borrowed long term would be hedged. So you have a profile that you keep a certain amount floating anyway. But yes, I certainly would be thinking tactically around that.
Thank you. That answers it fabulously. Okay, and finally, section 4.10 on Treasury performance. I note there that you're changing the benchmarking to having a look at what our budgeted line cost is for borrowing versus the actual as being a benchmark, but I'm not 100% sure that that's a benchmark. And so I was sort of trying to get my head around, first of all, what we're trying to achieve by benchmarking. I mean, benchmarking to me is comparing us to something outside, which is some industry norms, and going, how are we going against that? When we turn it inside and go, well, how we performed against what we thought we'd do, that sort of says, well, we're just managing it to what we thought we'd do. It's not really a benchmark type scenario. So I was just trying to get my head around what are we trying to do by doing the benchmarking first in the first instance, and then whether the comparative to budget is actually going to do that as an objective. And if not, then, well, we might as well drop the benchmarking completely, if you see what I mean.
Through the chair, I think I do find this benchmarking a little bit problematic, and I do agree that it is a little bit difficult. All I would say is that the actual budget that we set isn't just a number that we pluck out of the sky. It is we basically take our debt, expected debt profile, and we look at what we think the interest rates will be over the next year, plus what we've actually already got locked in and fixed. And I think what the Treasury advisors have said to us is that actually, at the end of the day, the most important thing for you is that what you budget and what you actually achieve, that they are actually comparable. So we've got reasonably aggressively low interest rates in our annual plan, and I suppose the risk that we run there is that we are actually managing the Treasury portfolio to that, because that's where it's actually the rubber's going to hit the fan. Is, you know, if the rates do go up substantially, we've got a lot of floating rate risk, and we don't actually achieve our budget. So sorry, I'm not sure if that entirely answers the question, but
yeah, well, it does, to the extent that I suppose I understand that we have an annual plan. We have a sort of like a targeted forecast interest rate cost relative to what we think the debt will be and what our interest rate exposure is and will be, and that sort of, like, to me is like business as usual type stuff as opposed to a policy type issue. When I read the benchmarking, I sort of thought, well, this is what's our average interest rate compared to Tasman or Kapiti or you know, something like that, which again is sort of well, in its own way, it's nonsensical, because our debt profile is different to theirs, and when we got it is different to when they got theirs, and all that sort of stuff. So I just was really flagging in my own mind, what are we trying to do? And I think if we're going to put this clause in, then we shouldn't be calling it a benchmark. We should be calling it a management tool or a management system or something like that, our interest rate. And I totally accept that that's the best way of doing it. I've got no issue with that. It's just, I don't think we should be calling it benchmarking if it's just what we're doing to manage our profiles and our exposure.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. I was interested in this as well because when I read this, I thought surely we would have been previously doing both. We would have been comparing it back to what we thought internally, as well as looking at it against the LGFA credit curve. And I wondered why the external thing, Ms. Harrison, the LGA credit curve, no longer sort of formed a valid benchmark, and does that mean that we didn't previously have that internal comparison as well, or that internal check against budget? It resonated with me a little bit as well as to what was the benefits to the organisation of making that change. Did we not previously match this internally? I presume we did.
Yes, through the chair, you're quite clear. We do actually we do know what our actual interest rate is against budget, but I think the reality is we've never really focused on it because capital expenditure's been below budget, so therefore you don't need to worry about your interest cost is naturally below budget because you haven't always fully drawn down the debt that you expect to. So I don't think we have focused specifically on what that weighted average interest rate is. It's in your annual report, but I don't think we've never really focused on it as a benchmark.
Mr. Murray?
And finally, on page 49, I just want to make a comment about this clause that I presumably we need it to go with the LGFA, but the clause says to minimise concentration risk so that the LGFA requires that no more than the greater of 100 million New Zealand or 33% of council's borrowing, that's the greater of, from LGA will mature in any 12-month period. Now, our total debt isn't 100 million, that's the first bit. And if we were going to go with the 33%, our debt levels would have to be 300 million, which is out of policy anyway, and out of scope and out of size. So while appreciate that that's gone in there to satisfy or help out with LGFA sort of requirements, it's a wee bit of a nonsense clause from where the council sits relative to its debt levels, where it's going to, and all the rest of it. So it's more of a comment, but I appreciate it needs to be in there for their purposes.
Through the chair, noted, and it probably applies more to Auckland than us, really. And also, sorry, I would just like to also suggest, I was hoping to have the Treasury advisors here today, but I will be looking to have them at one of our September audit, risk and finance for a bit of a presentation. So,
Thank you. Is there any further questions on that? Councillor Dahlberg?
Yeah, thanks. I was sort of thinking on that same line about how do we actually compare ourselves? Because when I'm in the council, we seem to be moving stuff sort of forward and some stuff comes backwards, and as you said, we underspend or we don't. So I'm kind of thinking, how do you actually compare yourself? And I would have thought the local government FA was where to go, because what other group do we match? So that bottom piece against that, margin against the credit curve, I'm kind of thinking why it's being shifted, or how do we actually know we're going well, apart from we've underspent or overspent? Because the public out there probably just think we didn't get our budget right for the start. That's the reason you didn't underspend. So I deal with this all the time with who's telling me how well they perform, benchmarking in my industry. And it always seems to be the tricky bit is how you get and who you compare yourself against. Otherwise you can just get whatever result you want. So I wouldn't mind some discussion around that really. How do we know how well we're performing, apart from someone comes down with a review and says you're doing okay or great or whatever?
Did you want to cover that now? Because if
I
so,
think we just covered that in the discussion. I just sort of like, maybe staff can tell me, if I'm explaining to someone how great Nelson Council is, how would I know, apart from the fact I work here,
Ms. Johnson?
Through the chair, I think that's probably a wider benchmarking question than this is a very specific benchmark around our borrowing costs. And I think there are obviously a number of initiatives in place in the sector to actually to benchmark different councils' performance. And obviously we have KPIs around capital expenditure delivery and things like that, and operational expenditure. I know that there's the LGNZ Excellence Program, which we have participated in, which is one sort of what you could call a benchmarking exercise. And there are a number of different benchmarking opportunities within different parts of the business as well. So it's probably a separate conversation to.
Thank you. Something we'll come back to about it. Yes. Is there any further discussion in relation to this, Madam Mayor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a few questions and comments. So just in relation to the LGFA requirements, so what we've had to insert into our document in relation to the 100 million or 33%. So if that isn't actually a control really for our in our policy, because it's the scale of what it is, can I just be directed to what the control really is, the one that would have the most weight in terms of what is there? I'm presuming it is what's sitting above that. So if we're saying, well, essentially that isn't a control mechanism for Nelson City Council because we've given the scale of where it is at, it's more relevant to larger councils. What is the control? So I'm a bit fascinated that they haven't just adjusted it down for someone of our size.
Through the chair, this control is not for us. This is a control for them, that they don't have, so that the local government funding agency doesn't have the concentration risk from one particular council in one particular period of time.
Ah, I understand.
So
okay, so
it's pushing.
I understand.
They want assurance. So LGFA want assurance that we have the policy in place that protects them.
Right. Okay. So the
effectively. So it really is, and I do apologise. It is a bit of an awkward one, but it really is just, as I say, to protect LGFA from say the Auckland Council, and they do have concentration risk around Auckland, the LGFA, so they have to be careful that as things mature off, that they aren't exposed particularly to one council at one period of time.
Okay, that's
So
great.
it's
Thank
their
you.
protection.
What I needed to read was the of a councils rather than just I missed that. Sorry, as I was reading the councils and I was going a bit puzzled. That's fine. Thank you. And then on to the I just want to clarify, just make absolutely sure in terms of we've got a report coming later today to commercial subcommittee that deals with the ETS, and I just want to make sure that whatever's in that commercial report would be consistent with the policies that are here. There's nothing that will be out of step. Apologies, I'm playing a bit of catch
Through
up
the
here.
chair, no, it's
Okay,
consistent.
excellent. And then we've got a section on page 51 which relates to guarantees. And just as a bit of a reminder, when was it that we last gave a guarantee? I know we've got that section in and we're these days very reluctant to do that. So I'm just wondering when we last did that and how many we've got.
Through the chair, now I've got this on my audit program, my committee program, that we bring this back once a year, and I think it'll be later in the year. This is, so we have a guarantee with the local government funding agency, and I don't think we've got any other guarantees outstanding that I'm aware of. There was one small one for some rugby club or something,
Okay,
and it's
all right.
disclosed in our annual report.
It is? Okay,
but
all right, so-
my understanding is that the guarantee to the LGFA is the only one that we have outstanding. It's not something that has occurred since I've been here.
All right, so this is in relation, we will provide financial guarantees to local organisations, groups and bodies for recreational and community purposes. obviously we can't give guarantees on CCTOs under the Act. So so in relation to organisations where they have borrowed elsewhere, so essentially we're looking at where organisations borrowed from a bank, we are not sitting there as guarantor at the moment.
Through the chair, no, we've got absolutely no guarantees outstanding,
All right.
other than the local government funding agency.
And if I was
guarantee.
looking for what happens if we've loaned and we have a default, I wouldn't be looking at this section then. No. Okay. Thank you. And then I think that was it actually in terms of what last one is just in relation to page 54, where we set out the delegated authorities and limits. And I just want to make sure that Nikki, that you've had a good review of this to make sure that the delegations are where they need to be, and particularly in relation to disposal of assets and other matters. Is that current section actually working well for us in practice in terms of how the delegations are exercised, both across committees and at a staff level? Because I'm conscious that often there's a bit of a cascade for things always to make their way up to council. I'm just wondering, when you've looked at that, whether that's actually where it should sit, or whether we should have, we've got the delegations sitting at the right levels.
Through the chair, in terms of the treasury policies, I think they work reasonably well. I know that we're probably due a bit of a review of the delegation register, and I was thinking that was due to come to council at some stage soon. Yeah,
We'll look at it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Is there any further questions? Just wanted to make a comment, I think, in relation to policies like this, having them come formally to governance every 3 years is okay, but I think the importance of that internal annual review, highlighting anything, and the ability to bring it in the face of major change is a really key part of that agreement to go to a 3-year process. If there's no further discussion, could I ask that this committee receives the report, and I'll similarly, in the same motion, recommend that council adopt the amended liability management policy. Do I have a mover for that? Thank you. Moved by the Mayor, seconded by Councillor Dahlberg. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Okay. Carried. Thank you. We move then to item 11, to carry forwards. And I think again this is Ms. Hughes. Thank you, Tracy.
Through the chair. So this report is the first of 2 carry forward reports. The next one will be coming to this committee, I believe, in September. The 2 carry forward reports have slightly different purposes. Those of you who were on this committee last year may remember that the interim carry forward report, that was the first year we did that, and the purpose really is to ensure that ongoing work can continue until the final carry forward report can be compiled and brought to committee. So the key thing about this really is that all of these funds have actually been approved. It's yet another of those timing issues, really. There's been a lot of carry forwards approved through committees in the last month, but obviously time doesn't stand still and circumstances keep changing. So this is what this report is trying to keep on top of.
Thank you. Questions, clarifications for Ms. Hughes? Madam Mayor?
I don't have any questions for Ms. Hughes. I just have, because Ms. Hughes is reporting, reflects where the asset managers are getting to with their projects. So what it probably does, I would say, is that the asset managers need to do their very best to continue to try and deliver within the financial year. I'm looking at some of these projects that are moving forward, and I know some of the background to why they're moving forward, but equally I'm conscious of that cascade and actually the wave that it can create as we just start to move things from one financial year to another in terms of the workload. So there are projects on here that cause some of us in this room considerable grief that one day I'd like to see not being carried forward. I'd like to see them completed. But that's not a message for Ms. Hughes, it's a message for the asset managers.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Yeah, again, just it's sort of part of me getting to grips with being on the subcommittee, but it is from my point of when you, as a councillor, you do actually kind of like to know that someone's keeping a record of all the bits that keep moving. That's the first challenge, I think, which the Mayor was indicating as well. And so I'm looking down here on the questions, and I'm getting to the fact we're coming to July as well, which is that date to move over. Apart from the fact that I'm not quite sure, I suppose I'll leave it as, it's great that it's actually listed somewhere, but it's a struggle when you're actually dealing with it as it moves forward. And I get the idea of the resources, I get the idea of the staff stuff going on, but I suppose the component really is at least it's being recorded somewhere.
Thank you, Councillor Delberg. Any further questions, comments? Madam Mayor?
Mr. Chair, I actually think this is a really useful report too, and I would just recommend that we just put this in front of all the committee chairs, that that they actually have a look at this, because it gives them a level of detail and a very succinct way of just some tracking and some questions that they need to be asking with their group managers, just to make sure that they've picked up where projects are going, and so we'll see the next report come through. So maybe just as a mechanic from this meeting, if we could ask that this report is sent to the all of the committee chairs to be noted and followed up with their GMs, because it's just a really simple summary that I think is quite helpful. Really good, I'd have to say very good commentary on the side here. The carry forward comments are really helpful.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think that's a good idea. The Chief Executive, Acting Chief Executive would like to make a comment. David?
Yes, very.
Thank you, Mr. Hammond. That's useful. Councillor Delberg.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chair. I kind of, I need to probably clarify my other comment really, is that sometimes it's not actually of our own makings here. For example, we're waiting for the New Zealand Transport Authority to make a couple of decisions, and they're getting caught because of something else. So I get the idea sometimes it's cascades, but that report there was kind of very useful. I'm not quite sure how often it turns up here. It's the first time I've seen it. That I kind of like, to help me figure out where else the other bits are going in my role on other committees.
Thank you. I agree. It's a very useful report. I'm always sort of focusing on the gap between the lines on the capital graphs, and this often helps clarify some of those, in addition to the major status report, major project status report as well. Thank you. If there's no further questions on that, would somebody please move that we receive the carry forward report, and that we recommend to Council that they approve the continuing work on the 16-17 projects within the 16-17 approved budgets, noting that we will get a complete report coming to us on the 8th of September, coming to this committee on the 8th of September. Somebody so move? Thank you, Councillor Delberg. Seconder? Thank you, Mr. Murray. All those, any further debate? Not all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. We'll move to item 12, Council Risk Management Policy and Risk Criteria, and welcome Mr. Vaughan to the table. Over to you, Steve.
Morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I don't propose to make a meal of this because this was a matter which was discussed at some length in a full council workshop on risk management generally earlier this year. And so this is really the completion of that process. And I guess I'm not going to make further comment and perhaps invite people to ask questions and leave it at that.
Thank you, Mr. Vaughan. Questions on the risk management policy and criteria? Mr. Murray.
Yep. Thank you. My first question was going to be around what's the whakapapa of this document, and you've sort of just given us the last wee piece, but could I ask you just to go back and just explain or outline for me where this document's come from, who's had input into it, and how did it get to the table today, other than through the workshop, because I appreciate the workshop.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'm going to answer this question generally about how these things are formed and then refer particularly to what was done in this organisation. In general, organisations start doing things about risk. I think that's probably the way to describe it. And then we get to the point where we start to think about what it is that we should be doing specifically for us, tailoring, if you like, principles to the organisation concerned. We started that process before I came to this role in February of last year, and I took a look at where it was, and you'll see reference to this in the covering paper, that we have in fact had a framework statement approved by this organisation, approved by the council, recommended from this committee, or rather its predecessor. And we then looked at that and thought, where are we up to now? What is it that we should be doing and doing better and more specifically for this organisation? This policy was put together by me by going around the organisation, very, very largely listening to what was going on and where it ought to go to. It went to our executive group, to the senior leadership team, and I think, Nikki, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I think in August last year, and at that time we started using it as a sort of practical tool, knowing that we would want to come first to this committee and then to the council to get it more formalised. Obviously there has been an election in between, and some of the members have changed. So we are at this point, and we are, and as you've referred to, we held a workshop earlier this year for all council members to discuss some of these concepts, and these things are built in to both the policy statement and to the criteria document which accompanies it.
Thank you. So in terms of, and this is, again is just a bit of a contextual question for me in terms of where this policy sits, but in terms of local government itself across New Zealand, is this policy similar, different, in the middle? How does this sit with other councils, or is it not even comparable? I don't know.
I'd like to think we're a bit out front. Lots of councils have risk management framework documents of various sorts, and when you look at those, they contain elements of what we've got in this policy in various ways. I'd like to also to think that New Zealand's a bit out front in this area. We were the originators of designing standards on risk management in the middle 1990s. We had a very substantial influence on what is now the current international standard, ISO 31000, and we have certainly, and I sit on the committee that does this, had a substantial input into the revision of that standard. So we are, I think, a little bit front edge compared with some other councils. Almost all of the councils I have talked to, certainly of comparable ones, have some elements of what we've got here, largely in these more generic framework documents.
Okay, now, looking at the policy itself, I had a massive question coming out of reading the policy, and the question is, where does the governance role sit in all of this? Now, I'm looking through the policy, looking for what's our role in terms of management of, or not management of, but in terms of risk within the organisation. Given we've got a lot of work happening amongst the troops, so to speak, and we've got a policy here for approval, but yet when I look at particularly page 80, for instance, which is, I get the graph, I get the chart, but when I have a look at that middle column that says authority for continued risk tolerance, red through to green, I don't see any reference to anyone other than the CE or SLT. Or if council was involved, it's at the CE's discretion. So I'm sort of looking at this group going, other than approving this policy, which doesn't mention us, we've got no other job to do in risk, which sort of doesn't run contrary to what I would have expected. Okay. So anyway, I'll just throw that in there.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry, if I can just intrude in that. Mr. Vaughan and I have discussed this as well. Maybe at the same time, Mr. Vaughan, it's on the same vein, and I think you could answer both questions with one, is reference to clause 5.4, which seems to absolve elected or appointed members of any application of this in decision making, and I think you can cover both of those off at the same time.
Yes,
Thank
indeed.
you.
And of course, just if I could just interject again, if I may, I suppose risk management's all good, but when a risk crystallises, and I'm very mindful of this, if indeed a risk does crystallise, because that's what risk sometimes does, then it's the people around the wider table here that actually have to answer the questions. So, it's almost like this disconnect in my head about what's going on. So, that's a further comment.
Dear me, there are a number of questions here. Let me see if I can deal with them in some sort of logical way, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let's talk a little bit about the governance role, and this is in sort of classic risk management current practice for governance entities, and clearly that is the council in this case, and by definition, this committee obviously being part of that. Governance roles fall into, I guess, two principal areas in classic risk management. The first of those is to understand and be assured, and I use that word advisedly, that the organisation's management is managing risks. It's the management's job to manage risks, and let's be fairly clear about that. I don't think it's a reasonable expectation on any person sitting around any of these tables to do day-to-day management of risks. You have professional staff who do that. I think that needs to be clear. So there is this oversight role, and in my book, the obligation to ask the sort of questions you're asking me this morning, and certainly when we bring quarterly reports to this committee, ask questions about those matters. It's the oversight assurance role. The second area is in terms, and Mr. Peters from the chair has made reference to this, in terms of strategic decision making. Governance entities in organisations quite clearly make strategic decisions. There is carefully worded here in the clause in the policy that the chair has referred to, a piece of advice which says that in making those decisions, the governance body, at whatever part thereof, it could be a committee and it could be the council, should get good advice about risks before coming to those decisions. There is a borderline, and you'll forgive me, Mr. Chair, if I refer to the fact that we have discussed this prior to this meeting. There is a borderline between requiring that and advising that it should be done in the context of the representative roles of the people who sit around these tables. And there's a bit of language here which I think, Mr. Chairman, you're suggesting should be discussed, and I would, without putting words in anybody's mouth, suggest that that's a good idea as to how far that goes. So yes, management is in the business of managing risks in any organisation that I'm aware of, and we are suggesting that is the case here. Yes, governance entities clearly have that oversight role, and I hope that's clear enough in this policy. If it's not, it's something that we need to make clear. And yes, in strategic decision making, there clearly needs to be consideration of risks. But I would point out something that I said as clearly as I could possibly find the way to say earlier this year at the workshop, that there are several roles for the people who sit around the council table and this table, and those roles include representing particular interests in the community, and those matters have to be put together in any set of making choices which include risk. There was a series of questions there, and I hope I've covered at least part of all of them, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Murray?
Yes, so thank you. So by way of response, I suppose by virtue of the fact I've asked the question, it's not clear in here what the governance role was, and I think I'll move to a point where I'll suggest eventually that we incorporate a section in here around how this interfaces with the governance. And I'm going to suggest also, but it depends on the answer to this next question. On page 79, we have there the Nelson City Council risk criteria July 2016, which presumably has come forward from previous policies, presumably. I'm looking at that and I am a wee bit confused, well, not confused, I don't know if anyone from the governance area has had any real input into this table in terms of what these levels are and when certain triggers actually do occur. And so I was just going to ask just for some comment on how this table's been built and what interface with elected members what interface they've had with this setting of these criteria for us to have a wee think about that, if I may.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, again through you to respond specifically to the matter of risk criteria, and again sort of classically, these are built up from inside the way organisations operate. This was done in this case. This was discussed at some length in the workshop earlier this year, and I specifically invited members of the council, and I think with the exception of the chairman actually, everybody was at that workshop, for comment and input before we got to this point. There were some comments and there were some relatively small changes made to, I think, largely the consequence criteria. That's table 1 of the risk criteria. There were no comments made in relation to table 2, which effectively is the, if you like, structured levels of likelihood for qualitatively estimating risks. This is what this whole table is about. And there were some requests for clarification, and you'll see specifically that there is an explanatory note in respect of one of the areas of consequence that came from that meeting.
Okay, thank you for that. I was at the workshop, and unfortunately I can't remember going through this table, but that could be my recollection. So okay, so we'll park that for the meantime because I'll hold that for the debate. I just have one final question, if I may. And fortunately or unfortunately, we have a health and safety report in our papers today as well. And I just want to dwell on 1.3 here, and it says, this policy does not provide detailed methods for Nelson City Council to manage its risks. Okay, so what you're essentially saying, here's the policy, it sits here, but it doesn't provide the methods. Now, when I have a look at the health and safety policy, it talks about a health and safety guide and a health and safety manual, and this is how we're implementing health and safety throughout the organisation. And that, I suppose by contrast, that sort of clause says, oh, we're going to do the same thing in terms of having a risk management manual of how we do it at some stage. Do we know, am I correct about that, and do we know when we're going to have this manual ready to go in terms of, a clear understanding across the organisation of how we identify, assess and manage risk, so it's consistent?
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, again through you, we do have a specifically laid out procedure in the Council's procedures libraries about the how-to. There is a reference to it in the start of the policy. And it refers explicitly to something, a procedure called manage risks in the procedure library. That's where we've got to. I'm not, I guess I have to betray a personal prejudice here. I'm not a fan of big manuals where they can be avoided, to be perfectly honest. I much prefer that we provide people with nuts and bolts ways of doing things at the appropriate level for where they sit in the organisation. And that was the idea of this stepping from a policy, the what to be achieved, to the procedure, the how to do it.
Thank you. Thank you through the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. Is there anything that you want action on in relation to any of that at this point, or is it just at this stage a case of raising the awareness as expressions of...
I'll wait for the debate section of the process. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Delberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just thinking, we asked about, we mentioned before about other committees, for example, the Chief Executive's Committee and how health and safety, etc. Risk comes to there. That might help enlighten some people. Would you like to make a comment?
Would you like me, Mr. Chairman, in response to that, to say where we would like to get to, which I can do, or where we are at now?
What would best answer your question, Mr.
Yes.
Councillor Delberg?
Okay. Again, I'd refer in the policy specifically to this clause 5.4, Mr. Chairman, that you've already referred to, and that is encouraging, if I can use that term, the governance part of this organisation to expect that they will be presented with information about risks each time they are presented with matters for decision. Are we doing that terribly well yet? I don't think so. Have we started? Most definitely yes. So I attempt to perhaps answer both sides of the question I sort of hopefully could see this heading to, but Mr. Chair, through you, if further clarifications is required, I'm happy to do further.
It covers what I'm seeing sort of in reports we get now. The question was really does risk management, health and safety, etc., come to different groups or different committees? And really, I sit on the Chief Executive Committee, and we get sort of certain stuff arriving there, and stuff does arrive different committees, which I think might help Mr. Murray, really, that we do get that eventually out. And I just thought you might want to comment on that. You know, different committees ending up with different risk management tools, or even the health and safety for the CE's role, CE committee.
Mr. Chairman, through you, I can make comments specifically with respect to one and probably not to the other, because I'm not privy to what happens in one of those committees. I think that's proper, that unless you invite me, otherwise I shouldn't be. With respect to health and safety, we've taken very considerable care to line up the criteria used for judging health and safety situations, if I can put it that way, with these overall council criteria. And in general, that means the first two sets of consequences are matched quite carefully to the way health and safety procedures are put together for this council. And we spent quite considerable time doing that, and in fact, specifically in the safety criteria set in table 1 of the consequences, those are matched explicitly to both how we do things around here, if I can put it that way, and to the obligations set out in law. You will see terms there that in fact come from the health and safety legislation about levels of consequence.
Thank you, Councillor Delberg. Any further questions of clarification? Madam Mayor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Vaughan, can you just help me work through these tables? I just want to go through an example.
Yes.
So I just want to see what might happen, so that I can understand the cascade. Let's imagine a scenario. How can we play this out so that we can see what will happen? Are you happy to do that?
Yes,
Right,
most
okay,
certainly.
right.
Mr.
So
Chair, through
let's
you.
okay. So let's imagine. I'm just going to try and think up something that will actually sort of give us some ability to work with us on the fly. Let's say we are going through we're promulgating a piece of public policy that will regulation that we have to consult on with the public. And we have put that together. It creates public outcry. Some of the advice turns out to be not legally compliant, and we've really upset iwi. Then what? What do I do next? Okay. Let's
Mr.
go to that
Chairman,
scenario.
with your permission, I would like to sort of step back to build a little bit of a framework around this little scenario which the Mayor has kindly given us, and that may take a little bit of time. In the workshop, I spent a bit of time with sort of the application of risk management tools, and this is, and I'm going to emphasise that word management for a moment if I could. In general, starting to think about where risks may occur you should start with what you want to achieve. In formal risk management language, the objective. You then need to think about events which might have consequences, and you notice that I use the word might. Events that might have consequences with some likelihood will lead you to risks. This table now allows us to structure the consideration of those events. So let's take I'm going to have to sort of extrapolate a bit here if I could, again with the permission of the people around this table. Let's take the event that there was public opposition to a given course of action by the council. Will you forgive me around this table for using perhaps the case of the Brook Reserve to make this a little more pointed? That is a question.
I would prefer if you remain hypothetical.
Yes,
Okay, I'll do my best to do
Thank
so
you.
without
Yes. I haven't been privy to the debate around
No.
that particular issue, so it's,
Let's suppose we promulgate a bylaw that blue shirts and yellow ties are now banned. Okay, there we go.
Thank you, Madam. Yes, so there is the events that the objective, if I've understood the Mayor's case correctly, is to prohibit in certain parts of the city, or all of the city for that matter, blue shirts and yellow ties.
Yeah, we'll go with that. It'll do.
Yes, that's the objective. So there may be events which have consequences for the council with some likelihood that that will affect getting to that objective. One of those events is likely to be that the chairman and I stand up and shout and object, as we're both wearing blue shirts. That we scale using this table to say how much of a consequence is that likely to have and of what type. Well, clearly there are limited financial consequences and clearly there are limited health and safety consequences, except if the chairman and I presumably get into fisticuffs about this. But there are likely to be reputational consequences for the council, and we can measure those using the scale. There are, and the scale we've come to after we thought this matter working around the council, is that this could be a matter of minor comment in the social media around town. It could be picked up by the local newspapers, it could be picked up by the national newspapers, and criticism made of the council. Those are scales of consequence that we've got in front of us. Each of those consequences has a certain amount of likelihood. I suspect in the matter of blue shirts and beg your pardon, yes, blue shirts and yellow ties, this is likely to be a local matter, unless it's a dull day in the news media. And so we've seen a scale of consequence which is most likely, and the likelihood of that occurring, well, again, you then go over to your second table and look at the right-hand side of that table and say, well, best estimate based on debates about male clothing are that that's possible to happen. And so we combine those two, the consequence and the likelihood, and arrive at a level of risk. In this case, I think it's probably in medium, if I'm making this up as I go along, and I apologise if I haven't quite...
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, could I just interrupt? Let's assume we've got something, just to help me here, that ends up, it's going to end up in that first table, and it hits extreme, let's just do one that's going to hit the extreme on political, community, reputational, the extreme on, or put it in a, we'll just keep it simple because then we can multiply by 3. It's going to hit 3 extremes. It's going to hit political, community, relationship with iwi and legal compliance.
Okay.
So am I assuming then, Steve,
So you then have to think, and again, through you, Mr. Chair, I'm remembering to do
and
this
it's
when
really
I
like,
can.
it's going to hit, and it's likely to happen.
Yeah, so all 3 are equally likely. This would be quite an unusual circumstance, I would respectfully suggest, but so all 3 are extreme and equal to the point of almost certain. So we go over and we see that the level of risk from our little lookup tables, that's what we're effectively doing, we're doing some lookups, is in the red space. It's red traffic light territory. And the direction is then that we do not tolerate that, looking at table 3, we take some set of actions. Either we have to positively say as a management decision that we accept that for usually only for a while, or we make some choice about it, or we say we take some action immediately to reduce that risk. So the guidance comes from that third table. Before I go on, Mr. Chairman, I don't want to be taking too much time of the meeting. Madam Mayor, does that sort of help with
No,
the original question?
That does, because it's just I wanted to say, I want to make sure that I was playing it out actually how it was supposed to go in terms of the cascades, and I understand that it's
So
perfect. Thank
these
you.
are structured judgment things. They're not statistics, they're not mathematics.
Okay, thank you. Are there any further questions before I put the motion, and we can then have some debate on the motion?
To receive the report or to adopt?
Yeah, no, purely to receive the report, and then I'll ask for further debate.
I'm happy to move we receive the report.
Thank you. Somebody second that we receive the report? Thank you, Mr. Murray. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Sorry. Yeah, so we can receive the report. We received the report. I'll now open, we go through to the second one, and I'll ask for proposer a second, and I'll take debate before we vote on it. I think that's the process, isn't it? Thank you. Somebody second that? Thank you, Councillor Dahlberg. Further debate before we take the vote? Is any further debate on this?
The 5.6, for example, on page 76, it just says the effort applied to managing risk is always less than the value at risk. My concern there really is value. Are we putting staff and people in there, or how does
Mr.
that work?
Chairman, can I thank the member for asking this question? It's a very important question. Value at risk is not just monetary, and it's not just somebody's health. It's sometimes, and Madam Mayor made the point very nicely a moment ago, that it's sometimes a matter of the reputation of the organisation and therefore its ability to continue to function. So those value scales are not monetary, and they're not always measurable together. They are matters of judgment at each time. So you may well choose to go back to Madam Mayor's somewhat hypothetical example, to spend some of the money dealing with the matters of high reputational risk, which are not monetised. There's no way of measuring those in money terms, because to not do so would jeopardise the ability of the organisation to keep functioning.
Through Mr. Chair. So my question becomes really around that word. If I was someone outside looking at that, I'd just be saying, you're always worrying about the money. So do we have a bracket there with explains that, or is that word value explained somewhere in the report?
It's not explained in the policy as it stands, and if you wish some further explanation, it is quite easy to do that. I would be very happy to do so.
That's what I'd like, even a bracket with some explanation, because otherwise if I'm the public, I'm seeing value dollars. I think even a couple of wee words about staff and reputation.
Thank you, Councillor
That would help there.
Mr. Chairman, before we go on, there is a specific reference to what I've just described
Perfect.
in the covering paper, and if you like, and this is what I'm testing, we could use that concept to put it into the policy to explain this.
Like that, because just as it stands, I'm seeing we're going to end up on
Okay,
the
thank you.
wrong side of the public perception. Can I then go to 8.11, through you, Mr. Chair? Just that there, we said about review date shown on the cover page, or do we say somewhere that it's going to be every 3 years? You know, or an event of something important, we're going to change it? It just says review date shown, it doesn't actually tell me, or am I missing it? Is there somewhere that says it's every 3 years, which typically these things are?
Yes, I'm sorry, it is on the cover page of the policy statement. So this is by 30th of June 2020.
Okay. But what I'm saying is, does somewhere in here tell us we should be doing it every 3 years in the event of a new, I get we put a date there, but how do I know how we got to that date? That's what I'm saying.
I understand your point. I think what I would look for in this is some consistency with the policies, all of Council's policies, that they either use a date or they use something like this, but all refer to the same mechanism, 3 years. With
Mr. Chairman, I would need to be corrected by Nikki Harrison if I could. I understand that this is the standard way we do these things. If it's not, I need to change it and apologise.
Okay, it's something to.
No, not a case of apology, I just don't know how, if I came and knew and read that, how would I know it's going to be every 3 years? Now I know, because that's the election process. It'll take me a wee while to get there, but I now figure out what we're doing. The other bit there about the 3.A2, as far as practical with Tasman District Council and Marlborough. I suppose that's as good as we can say. I suppose that's.
Mr. Chairman, through you, can I just clarify what you're referring to there, or what the member is referring to?
I think we're sort
there
of
isn't
saying,
an A2 in the policy, so.
yeah, I'm sort of getting the whole overall objectives. It's sort of saying there, and then it's a style and method, and we're working with the other councils, and I suppose that's something we do across all our policies anyway. So that's sort of standard.
Mr. Chairman, through you, I'd need to clarify exactly what the member's referring to. I can answer it in general in that, yes.
Page 78, 3.A, number 2. I suppose that's just our standard comment that we work with the councils.
This is directly quoted from our own organisational means
good.
of doing business.
That's what that's all. No, that's me done. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Madam Mayor, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Vaughan, I just want to run through a little bit more, following on from Mr. Murray's questions about where does governance sit on this, and we've sort of talked through that in the sense of it sits with this policy, making sure that we are satisfied that the framework is appropriately scaled, it cascades, it does its thing, it gets to where it needs to get to, and then we get to let's say we're in our very high red box down the bottom there, and things aren't going too well. And we have got the authority for continuing the risk, and Mr. Murray highlighted before that that's comes to council at the chief executive's discretion. So the chief executive is wearing the management risk here, and you've identified why that's important. That the risk is managed at a officer level
By managers.
By managers. Okay, it needs to be. If I go back and look through the document, and I would say my assumption is that this is a continuous process, so there is reassessment of risk as we work through different processes, and while something may have started off in the getting a bit yellow and a bit orange, we're continuously assessing the risk and adjusting as we need to, depending on what the outcome we were seeking is and the responses we're getting, so the consequence. And then we talk through this, and the one thing I just want to check with you, are you satisfied as we go through the layers of responsibility that we talk about the CE or SLT? Now, most people outside this organisation would have no idea what SLT is. And are you satisfied because that there is adequate documentation? Because if I go to the responsibility section of the report at 6 and I go to 6.3, we talk about SLT is responsible for requiring all decisions, including its own decision making, to be made in a manner which considers the associated risks. So it treats SLT as a body of its own. Are you satisfied that there's adequate documentation that exists in this organisation about the decision making of that body, and that it exists in a way that meets the requirements of open and transparent government?
That's, Mr. Chairman, through you, a large question. Management, let me answer this in generality and then refer where we are in specific terms in the guidance for the material prepared for the executive decision-making body, if I can call it that, the management executive decision-making body in this organisation at the moment. In general, managers have to be allowed to manage, if I can put it that way. And so you have to provide some mechanism which is reasonable for managers to be able to make decisions in some coherent fashion. In our organisation, as I'm sure the Mayor is aware, that is a business of writing advice to the executive decision-making body and having that advice considered and the people who wrote that advice explain themselves in front of the body. This is, of course, and again, a matter which I'm sure the Mayor is well aware of, that this is, of course, subject to the provisions of the Local Government Information and Meetings legislation. Are we providing enough guidance to the people providing that advice to the SLT, to the executive decision maker at the moment, is a question I've just asked myself again in the last couple of weeks in relation to a matter which came up, in fact, from this body or from the Council in full. And I think probably we can do a little better. We are doing reasonably well in providing that guidance, and you will see this in the back page of, and in fact in the back page of all reports. This is the one on this one, coming to council bodies. I'm not so sure that we have quite got that nailed to the extent that we should have in advice coming to the executive decision maker. It's something that I would like to go back and have a little look at as a result of putting this all together formally in the policy. That's probably as close as I can get to a complete answer to what's a very big question.
So, Mr. Chair, I think the reason I'm asking these questions are essentially what Mr. Vaughan is saying to us is that risk management is a management responsibility, and we know that the tolerance sits with the management of the organisation. It only comes by at the C's discretion will it come to the council table. So the council doesn't really have an ability to intervene unless the C chooses to send something up to council, which means that the processes have to be extraordinarily robust and performance needs to be measurable within that space. And what I'm just highlighting is that given that Mr. Vaughan's written a policy that identifies a body as a decision-making body, I just want to perhaps suggest that Mr. Vaughan, with the senior leadership team, you make sure that there are robust systems in place and processes so that if, for instance, we did have something that turned out into that very high extreme issue, sufficient that it had some fairly dramatic consequences, that if we had to go back and interrogate our processes to make sure that we were managing risk appropriately, that we would be able to demonstrate that we had the documentation around that and the frameworks that are referred to in this document. because that's certainly not, as a governor, a level of this organisation's activities that I am exposed to as mayor. So it does require, it's not something that sits in the public arena. I have seen Lagoima requests come in relation to those matters, and I would just say they need to be, if they're going to be in here, and that's the framework we're using, and the responsibility is lying at different levels in the organisation, whether it's chief executive, senior leadership team, managers, that they all have the frameworks and the documentation that they need to demonstrate that they're complying with this policy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I respond very briefly to that?
Yes.
I think I will take that as a direction from this body to do that piece of work in respect of providing people with the tools where advice is given to the executive decision makers, to put that a bit higher up the priority list as a result of this morning's debate.
Thank you, Mr. Vaughan. Take Mr. Murray. I have a comment I'd like to make as well at the end of those. Mr. Murray first.
Thank you. Just in response to Mayor Reese's comment there, that was a very succinct summary of where the document is in terms of risk management as a management issue. For mine, in my consideration, I think that as an organisation, the main difference we have between us and a business out there is that we have a higher political risk. And the political risk falls with the political people primarily, and therefore I'm looking at this going, is that actually right to say management manage risk in its totality, with a little bit up to council if the CE so decides to do so. And so I suppose my question is actually, is that the proper position, and is that where council is comfortable? And I'm not convinced in my mind that that is the case. And I'm pondering, again, I tend to ponder a lot as to whether, particularly in those orange and red areas, that there shouldn't be a mechanism where council can interface and engage with, by matter of right or as part of the process, with these particular issues. And so if I flick that around, I would be horrified if we had a red issue that we described, and actually you read about it in the paper because someone decided not to tell you about it, or anyone around here about it. So I think for mine, I'm looking at this going, yep, it's a good policy in terms of where it's got to. I think there's a whole tranche sitting on the next bit of it, which is to explore that governance interface and to develop that to a point where there is a bit more communication between management, or the CE in this case, and council at the right level. And whether that's to the chair of audit and risk, or to the mayor, or to whoever, then I think it would be appropriate to incorporate that into the policy at this point. So I suppose I don't disagree with what you said, but I'm just saying I think there's another leg on this, which says this is how governance interfaces with this, and this is how it should happen. Yep, let management manage risk, but there is definitely a two-way street with the governance space, and that needs to be clear in here. That's my take. So for mine, I was going to propose an amendment to the resolution, which essentially.
Can I just make my comment before you do that, Mr. Murray? Just because I think I'm in the same space, and I just would like to make that comment before we put it to the vote. And I cast my mind back to having put several risk management processes in place in several organisations. The one thing I've learned is that policies evolve, and the reason they evolve is organisations become more mature in awareness around risk management. And I would categorise this organisation as not necessarily yet mature. And I think what we've got in front of us, it'll be no surprise to Mr. Vaughan, he's heard me say this before in our meetings. I think what we've got in front of us is a policy of a more mature risk organisation, where some of those processes, some of those places are in place, and all the people involved in the process are confident they're in place. And I don't think we've yet got that level of confidence. I think that's what you were alluding to, Madam Mayor. And so I think I would like to see a policy that recognises that there is still what may be some interim steps towards a more mature organisation, which can be reflected. So perversely, in some senses, as you mature, your policy simplifies. And I think I'm saying the same thing in a different way that the Mayor and Mr. Murray have said, is that I think we need some interim steps in this policy that make that more explicit about either the circumstances, the reasons, the compulsion, where there is an automatic escalation to a governance level that brings in the recognition that there is a vulnerability in such organisations as councils for some of these risks. I don't think that in any way undermines management's responsibility or ability to manage, because that huge reliance is still there, and that huge requirement and trust is still there to do that. I don't think that changes in any way. What it does, I think, is it helps management to mature, and it helps management make the organisation mature. And so I would like to see something in that space as well. So, Mr. Murray, if you
No.
okay.
If you would like to, Mr. Chair, if you'd like to work up some words, I'd be happy to move an amendment. But I would just perhaps could we just tease this out a little bit more to understand a bit better what it is that we're planning on doing, because I am conscious that being told about a risk is a little bit different than being able to do something about it. So this is the real challenge, and I would go, yes, I would expect. In some ways, I'm expecting an escalation factor here, that if we're getting into that very high, or even the high space, we should be thinking about what is happening in terms of making your governors aware that there's a risk. And in practice, that normally happens. There's some disclosure that there is a risk factor sitting there. But knowing about it and doing something about it is different. And I'm just pondering through this issue of, at the moment, as this is written, and the difficulty is that it's potentially, and this is where it comes to the reputational issues and who wears it, is that often the reputational damage, the consequence of that hits home very much at this table, and hits home very much in my office. So I'm just wanting to tease out this issue of, if we make a modification to this policy, we need to make sure that we don't undermine and essentially move the burden of responsibility incorrectly. We've just got to keep it so that we've got that, exactly what Mr. Vaughan's trying to achieve here, which is the management, the risk management processes, but how we move it to the right place to ultimately manage that whole risk. Because particularly when it comes to the reputational issues, the political issues, you actually do need one organisation to manage that. You can't have an organisation where the front face, the political face of the organisation, is the one that deals with public consequences for many of these things, separated out or essentially unable to actively assist with managing that risk. I didn't want, and I don't want to put Mr. Hammond on the spot, but I did wonder if he might have some helpful guidance for us at this point.
Yes, through the chair, I completely agree with the dialogue that's been happening, and as chief executive in the past, that's the system I've developed, is that both at an SLT level and at an elected political level through the channel, sort that out, there is an awareness of what the top 10 type of risks are, the ones in the red and the orange. If you like, we monitor those at the strategic table, probably the plus marks are more for the
Thank you for that, Mr. Hammond. I mean, just to let you know that we receive a quarterly risk report that does cover off the top 10 risks that we're covering. I think what my understanding of what we're faced with at the moment, or what we're looking at the moment, is really a process of escalation of things that happen suddenly, urgently within that time to a greater extent than not being aware of what the top 10 risk areas is what we do, rather than specific risks. And I think it's the recognition of those specific risks that is potentially causing the concern. And for me, it's an escalation issue rather than a management one.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vaughan.
Perhaps I can help the process by suggesting two places to look in the papers in front of you. The first of those is clause 6.4 in the policy, which says, oh, I'm sorry, I do beg your pardon. We'll try that again. I'm suggesting two places to look in terms of how we might structure this. The first place is in clause 6.4, which lays out a cascade of responsibility. Can I deal, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, can I deal with the matter at risk myself as a manager? If I cannot, it is my obligation to use my expertise to take it to a place where it can be dealt with. That's effective. I just paraphrased, slightly more formal wording in there. And the second place to look, as the GM Corporate Services has rightly pointed out, is this authority for continued tolerance in Table 3 of the criteria. I'm not sure, Mr. Chairman, how you would want to deal with those, but those seem to be the places where we can make a bit of modification to help this along.
Are we at a stage where, rather than trying to solve this by a further resolution, that we actually ask the officers concerned to go back, look at this, and bring back this policy to us with some amendments in it that address these concerns? Because I think we've made them clear enough. We won't at this stage, in those circumstances, we wouldn't refer this to council until we've got a final approved policy, or a policy with which this committee can support.
Annie? Before we do that, could I just have some feedback from the elected members as to whether they're happy with the table 1, the consequence rating, whether you're okay with the levels, because that'll be part of the policy. And I've got no idea. Mistakenly, I've missed it at the workshop. I was there, but I can't recall actually working through this in detail, although I can recall some feedback on it. But does that need to be looked at an elected level, or are we happy for that to roll through as part of the policy? Because if we're doing what you're suggested, then perhaps we should or shouldn't do that, depending on how you feel.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm going to assume that this is, in terms of this table, we've had some feedback on it through the workshop, and I'd say and then I'm assuming that it's also being considered in relation to, we're not doing this in isolation, so there would, perhaps, I'm sure Mr. Vaughan will have looked at this in terms of other organisations, particularly local government organisations, and it fits about right in terms of where it should be. I think it's one of the things where I could look at this and I could suggest some amendments to it, but it wouldn't be in a particularly informed way. So I think we're probably better to work with this and work it through, see what it's looking like in 6 to 12 months, and say do the adjustment at that point once we see where it fits, because we'll know that. So for instance, if we had some we don't really ever encourage things getting to the extreme level or the high level, but inevitably there, because of the complexity of the organisation we work in, there will be things from time to time, and we'll have a sense of a bit of a health check if that fits about right at a political level. we'll go, no, actually that should have been a that one that is rated as moderate here at a political level, we can consider it extreme, and so then we'll have to do some adjustment. But I'd suggest we work on a bit of an iterative basis with this
I'm happy
in
with
terms
that.
of what we do.
Councillor Dahlberg, your comment?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I had a quick look through these again. You know, like your significance, you get someone with a minor injury to multiple fatalities. That's kind of easy to follow. You know that. Then you get down to this thing about political and public confidence because you have 2,000 opponents via social media. You know, I mean, those numbers could change, and we're only going to know that once we actually start tracking it. I mean, you can get a couple of thousand likes just on something really stupid, you know, because it's kind of the political whim of it is you're taking the mickey out of someone, so consequently you end up with a large number, whether that's a big impact. So I think the numbers I've got down there look good. Well, sort of, I'm confident in them, but we won't know until we start monitoring that.
Thank you, Councillor Dahlberg. Madam Mayor?
Mr. Chair, I'm a bit reluctant to send this away to come back again because I'm conscious that we've just got to keep going on some of these things, and I wonder if there would be a way. I think in terms of if we could just sort of get to the point where we can summarise what the modification we're seeking is for this policy, whether we could get that into some sort of form and maybe delegate you as chair to work with Mr. Vaughan to amend the wording and then still send it on its way up to council. That may be too complicated, but I'm just conscious that every time that we bring this back, it's another 6-week cycle actually, and then another, you know, three more till it hits up to council again. Because I think Mr. Vaughan's right. I think where he's highlighted are the issues around responsibilities. I think he's got the right section there, and then it is that last table in terms of just that escalation. If I've understood Mr. Murray's concerns, and I think they're the ones that we've talked about. So if, with some modification to the section 6 in terms of responsibility, in terms of escalation, and table 3, I think we could get this to where it needs to go for council.
I'm happy with that suggestion, Madam Mayor. Do you want to, perhaps we can take an adjournment, have a cup of tea, and see if we can come up with something that we can then put in a recommendation to council that encompasses those things. Thank you. We'll take an adjournment. Thank you.
Right. Excellent.
And we have and I'm happy to move the amendment that's on the, or move the motion that's up on the screen now. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Madam Mayor. Discussion on the motion. Are we okay with that?
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. The question here include the clarification. Like, that's exactly what we want. That will turn up to the council when this thing goes forward, or does it come back and we somehow see that?
It would go straight to council.
And we'll debate it there. I'm comfortable with that, but as long as you're comfortable.
I mean, that's my understanding of what would happen with that in order to move it along as the Mayor has requested.
It would. That has a consequence. So, it has a consequence that what tends to happen is that when you do this to keep it moving, is that once that is worked through, then quite often the chair will circulate to the members of a committee what's going to go up to council, so you've got some input to it.
I would intend to do that, absolutely.
So the council will get, because normally they just get the minutes with the resolution in it, and they adopt it off the minutes. So they'll actually get the policy document themselves, and that will be in their papers. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
It's myself and the officers, and I will circulate it to the members of the committee. Yep.
Liking that. And then have a comment before it goes forward.
In that case, I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried.
Pardon. When this matter goes forward in obedience of that resolution, I will also correct the matter of the value at risk as referred to earlier by Councillor Delberg. Is that acceptable?
That makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to be absolutely
Thank you, Mr. Vaughan. Right, we move now to item 13. Internal Audit Report and the Annual Audit Plan. Welcome to the table, Lynn Anderson. Thank you.
Okay, so this is obviously looking at my internal audit plan for next financial year. And just a bit of a background maybe before we go into it. And just to let you know that what happened, or what has happened, and of course we haven't got to the end of this financial year yet, but we some of the underlying presumptions made have been based on things that like time that we estimate that audits should take based on our experience now and based on the complexity of the audit. And also there's been a little bit more revelation in relation to the input that other staff can have in audits. And that's mainly around, well, it's always around resource availability. And so the audit plan that was put in place for last year was, as it turns out, reasonably unrealistic. And so when I've looked at this particular audit plan, it takes into account those elements. So it takes into account the fact that we're really not, I can't really rely on other staff unless they have been assigned formally to assist. in the role of assisting with some of these audits, and I also now have a much clearer idea about the level of audit that's required for the kinds of audits that I'm proposing, and also the time that it takes to do those. So when we look at the, and the other fact that's in here that is important is that I'm going to be reducing my hours from the 1st of July. So at this stage, up till the end of this week, I've been a 0.8 FTE, and I'm going to become a 0.6 FTE. Now, to compensate for that, we have got someone else in the organisation who's been formally assigned to be able to make up that shortfall. And when you look at section 4.7 and 4.8 of the report, or the covering report, it shows that even with me reducing my time and with other staff not being able to complete audits, it looks like we can do almost a similar number of, well, we're only one audit different from this year. And the reason for that is because there's most of the audits that we're doing, there's a difference in the breakdown of the audits that we're doing in terms of the level of complexity. So the level of complexity overall has dropped, and so the audits a number of the audits shouldn't take so long. And in particular, if you look at the ones that are revisited, they're only expected to be quite short audits of a week duration. From start to finish. So I'm happy. The other thing that I need to draw to your attention, and that's in the report as well, under 4.3, is that when you approved the annual plan, you also approved $40,000 that's been budgeted for external audits this year, for the next financial year. There's two, when we go through and have a look, there's two that I've proposed. And they have been proposed as external audits because they're going to require a high level of data mining, and we don't have that capacity in-house. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Ms. Anderson. Questions on that? Mr. Murray?
Thank you, through the chair. Thank you for your report, Lynn. Always enjoy reading about internal audit activities and what's happening in this space. I was reading a little bit between the lines about the appointed staff member. Are you able to tell us who that is at this stage, or is that something that is a secret at this stage for whatever reason?
Through the chair, the intention is that Arlene will be doing that, and so Arlene's has worked in that quality assurance, quality management, project management space, so you know, she has those skills. Yep. Although not financial skills, she has the skills in terms of business process, which I think will add a level to some of these audits.
Okay, thank you. Follow up to that question, well, not, next question is, I see the work plan here, and there's a lot of topics and a lot of objectives, which is really good to see. How are the topics and the objectives selected and prioritised?
Through the chair, this was done initially. The initial workings of this was done when I first started. So I looked across the organisation with discussion with group manager, and we looked at all areas that we felt might be areas that should be audited, because absolutely nothing had been audited before. And then before we had a risk framework, which with risk criteria, which you've obviously just approved, we based it on a framework which came with the previous manager of organisational assurance. So it was very much health and safety basis for a risk framework. And so that was all rated based on that. Now, obviously we've matured a little bit since then. And so whenever I look at, and obviously there's also the ongoing risks that are changing as we go through, so they get incorporated into anything when I'm looking at rating everything. So everything gets re-rated when I review the new audit plan for the next year. And now it's being rated on according to the risk framework. We've been kind of working on this framework a little bit in the background before it's been formalised.
Okay, thank you. And so in terms of the, I suppose from what you're saying, a very busy program of 25 audit programs for the year relative to 26, you've explained some difference, a little bit of extra resource. How much capacity have you got in here to deal with stuff that comes up during the year that we might like you to look at, for instance?
Through the chair, there's a little bit of leeway, but I think where that is primarily, well, it may come from, will be in maybe doing a little bit of a balance between Arlene and myself.
Okay, so not a lot of capacity in real terms. So if I dumped a project of 100 hours on your lap, for instance, you wouldn't have the resource, you'd have to find it and figure out how to do it.
Through the chair, Mr. Murray, with one person and one, a 0.6 of a person and another 0.2 of a person, that's pretty hard to have an extra 100 hours, yeah.
So ongoing question. If I did identify an issue I wanted internal audit to look at, how would I, from this table, go about raising that as getting that onto the work program, so to speak, given that we've got a full program, fully resourced, little capacity? So if there's another, if something is there which I thought, okay, I think we need to look at this particular issue this year, or this has arisen which is outside of this program, how is that sort of like a fait accompli, it doesn't go anywhere, or how does that work?
Through the chair, that would normally go through the chairman of Audit, Risk and Finance Committee, who I meet with on a regular basis.
Okay, so if I then said there's some projects which I expected might have appeared on the list this year that aren't there, essentially to have those considered, I should talk to the chair and raise those with the chair, and then he can work back through there. Okay. Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Yeah, through Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Councillor Elberg, sorry.
I was interested in the do we have a full staff capacity and resource capacity for this? And so I'm gathering the capacity is 0.8 of a full-time employee.
In total, that's my understanding, yes.
Okay. And I gather also the fact that if it gets complicated, we put it out to an external group, and then we have to fund that, approve that funding. I get that as well. So that's it.
Through the chair, yes, that's correct, but it would be an approved external audit at that point. I think,
No, I get
because
that.
I only have a budget this year for $40,000, so clearly I can only spend $40,000 without council approval.
I get that too. So my question really comes down to, would there be any benefit for us having, that ability to data mine internally? I'm just thinking now that we're talking about working with systems, for example, with Tasman, etc., on different parts of the council business. Would that be an advantage or just another inconvenience, really, and it's better to use external?
Through the chair, I think it's not just data mining that we'll be doing. So, and each council works slightly differently. So, and we'll be using a different set of software. I mean, obviously we're very similar to Tasman in that we use the same software, but that's pretty much the only thing that's similar about the way that we operate. So, when I've looked at these particular 2 audits that I've looked at, but will cost us money, it will be very specific to us. And so I'm not sure whether you want to, and it'll be a degree of data mining and it'll be a large degree of process, but it will be understanding how, what the issues are in local government generally. So it needs to have, I think, experts who are really into that space and who have the ability to use all the technology and everything else that's available. It's not just a straightforward data mining issue.
Mr. Chair, yeah, that was partly my trying to get more information about some of the comments around other committees about how we share resources. And I just say thank you for your report and your frankness. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Dahlberg. Any other questions? Madam Mayor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just scroll back to the paragraph. Lynn, I'm just interested, this issue of resourcing is always challenging for us, isn't it? So in terms of how we get all the things done we want to do. When you refer to, in your report at 4.6, you talk about the fact of the 8 audits allocated to non-audit staff, only 2 of these are expected to be completed by the 30th of June this year due to the staff members' non-availability after performing their own formal responsibilities. So is that somebody, the other staff within the organisation that you need them to input essentially, do you, to be able to do this?
Through the Chair, yes. When I set up the audit plan for last year, I had allocated those 8 audits to individuals within the organisation, and from memory, I think most of them were around finance, and they're incredibly busy. They just can't do those kinds of things. And even, there was an element of where there hadn't been a conflict of interest because somebody hadn't been at all involved in an area, that moved as well. And so we don't have a lot of spare capacity for staff. I mean, we're running trim, so it's very, very hard to get them to do this kind of work when they're really struggling with their own work.
All right, I think when we've had one of these previous reports, we've talked about the challenge of getting the internal audit to be a priority across the organisation. So when you've got an area that you need to look into, actually making sure that you're getting the attention and responses from the business unit that you're auditing. Are you getting that now?
Through the Chair, yes, it is. It's a lot better. There's some areas it's more easily forthcoming because they have more capacity, but it's still not as good as I would like it. I can't be as efficient as I would like to be because there are delays because of people's other work.
Well, Mr. Chair, I just wonder how we assist Lynn in this space, because I'm conscious that the internal audit's a really important function. We have made good progress in the sense of establishing what's going on here. We've now got Lynn, and we'll manage with a little bit less of Lynn, but fit it in with somebody else. So we'll work our way through that. It is it is tight, but I would say that there needs to be a clear understanding by the organisation that when Lynn approaches for an internal audit, that needs to be a priority. So it's not an option. And I'm just wondering if there is anything more that we need to think about it as a committee to be able to establish that is the message. Because what I'm looking at is we've got a program, we had a program, we haven't been able to deliver all of that for a range of reasons, but once we establish the program, given that there are competing priorities, if we say we're coming, if Lynn says, well, I'm coming in to do the internal audit in business unit X really needs to be engaged. So I'm just, maybe that's a take out for the management across the organisation, just to make sure that business units are prepared. They've thought about that in terms of their program. There's an alignment thinking about where these things land, and I imagine, Lynn, that as you've gone through setting the timetable for the year, you've thought about what high pressure points parts of the organisation have gotten, so you try not to time yourself going in to do an internal audit at the point where you know one of the business units will be absolutely scrambling. So I presume that thinking has gone on in this.
Through the chair, yes, and particularly in relation to finance, and just trying to spread them out a wee bit so that managers don't end up with one audit after another in successive months.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. The Chief Executive's asked to speak to this, so Mr. Hammond. Thank you, Mr. Hammond. And if you can pick that up in response to the Mayor's concerns, I think it would address all of our concerns. So thank you. Anything further on that, Madam Mayor?
Just one other factor, just in terms of the timing of particular audits. It is useful from my perspective, and I imagine this is one of the other filters that goes into this, some thinking around business continuity is one, I think that's for May. And one of the factors that I would look at is the timetabling around the long-term plan and annual plan. So, and obviously until you get in to do an audit, you won't necessarily be sure whether one of the outcomes of that audit will be that part of council's under-resourced, that actually one of the risk factors we're dealing with is actually they're under-resourced. But as much as possible, if there is, that is contemplated in the initial sweep, the more that can coordinate with the timetabling for draft annual plans and long-term plans, from my perspective, the better that would be, just so that we can actually then have an action that can follow, just to make sure we do resource appropriately. Thank you.
Perhaps you can take that on board, Ms. Anderson. Any further questions? Councillor Delberg?
So my question then comes through, so we've now financial systems, etc. Have they got all the resourcing and staff that they are allocated or needed? I know we do have staff missing across the business, but does the financial services area have their quota of staff, or are we looking to more recruiting?
Mr. Anderson?
Through the chair, I think there's one vacancy coming up within that area that we're actively recruiting for at the moment, but yes, they've got running a full, they're running at their full FTE, and I suppose the focus for us is on really cross-training the staff so that we can cover any gaps within that. But the resourcing is tight.
Again, that's just part of, just me trying to figure out where the other bits of committees are and asking the right questions there. Thanks.
Sorry, Ms. Anderson, yes?
Through the chair, I just wanted to make a comment that with finance, they've got constant data that they're having to deal with, and so it just doesn't ever go away. So the pressure is always very high, and it's very difficult for them to find extra time. And a lot of the audits that I do end up in finance, for one reason or another. There's a component that will end up back in finance, and they've ended up with the lion's share of the actions that are required.
Thank you. Councillor Dahlberg, further question?
Sorry, just to follow up on that. So the next question then comes to systems. I mean, I'm not really sure what systems go across local government or whatever, or can you buy them off the shelf? It seems like some of the ones I'm hearing, we develop them. Have we got do we need support in there, or is this part of our development program of upgrading things or changing things? How can we help?
Through the chair, I mean, we use a common accounting system with Tasman District Council. It may be within the long-term plan that we look at whether or not we change or upgrade that system. We're constantly looking, I mean, the transactional volume within finance is really, really high, and we are constantly looking at ways to make that more efficient. We're looking at online systems for payments, that sort of thing, all the time. So, you know, we are constantly looking at ways of undertaking these transactions on a lower cost basis. So, at this point in time, I don't think there's anything, you know, that we're not doing to try and improve it, but I am flagging that we may need to look at that financial system in the next 10 years.
Thank you. Any further questions for Ms Anderson on internal audit? If not, could I ask that somebody move that we receive the report and that we recommend to council that they approve the revised, the internal audit plan. Thank you, Councillor Dahlberg. Seconder for that. Thank you, Mr Murray. Any further questions or debate? All right, I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you, Lynn. And we move to item 14, Health and Safety Governance Charter, and call Roger Ball and Malcolm Hughes to the table. Thank you. Over to you, Roger.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Before us, we have the Health and Safety Governance Charter Review. Some members around the table may recall that following the change in legislation, Council implemented a new suite of documents, including a policy, a governance charter and a strategic plan. With Mr Hughes' arrival in Council, we're going through this year and just reviewing and updating our documentation, and with the aim of actually shortening quite a bit of it down, and that's probably the main change in front of us. At the end of last year, we completed a review and updating of our sort of work level health and safety manual, which is a sort of a 90-page document, and that's the kind of go-to for the staff. As a result of that, what we've done is we've gone through the charter, the governance charter, which is in front of you now, and we've taken out of it stuff that we felt was at the wrong level or repetitive with other documents. So we've shortened it down. There is no change to the obligations on those around the table. There is no change to the substantive officer duties which are referred to in the legislation, but we hope we've provided a more succinct document for governance purposes. So I'll stop there, Mr Chairman, and quite happy for us to answer questions.
I think it's a very succinct, clear document. Well done.
And thank you for this important part of managing our health and safety, because we want everyone to be safe. So, same thing. Just read 3-pot ticks everywhere. I'm happy to move and second the reports, etc.
We'll move to item 15, another important policy, I think, for a mature and practicing organisation, and I think you're going to talk to this for us, are you, Ms Harrison?
Through the Chair, yes, I'll make this brief. I mean, this was due for review, the protected disclosure policy. This has really been brought to the subcommittee for noting. It's scheduled for review every 3 years, and really the only minor amendments have been made in terms of the designated officers. So happy to take any questions.
Any questions on this one? Mr Murray?
Thank you. Through the Chair, this paper sort of challenged me a little bit in a couple of respects. And first of all, I was challenged around, one, we're noting it, and I note the reason for that is it's an organisational policy rather than a council policy. But I struggled to see what the difference was in real terms. So I don't know how you have an organisational policy which isn't a council policy because it's a council policy either way. So that sort of got me to think about, well, is there a whole suite of organisational policies which we don't see technically, and if we don't see those, why are we noting this particular one as opposed to all the rest of them? So I got a little bit confused through that sort of debate in my head around what's organisational policy, what does it actually mean in real terms, and why this one as opposed to the others, and what are the others. So that was the first sort of question. And then the second question, sort of like, you know, when I stepped back and had a look at this policy and then tried to think about why it was here, it's obviously an important policy. But then I asked the same question that I did in the risk one, which is, where's the governance interface here? And if the policy in itself is important enough to bring up to us to note, to say, yeah, we know it's there and it's operational, which I would call it a whistleblowing thing, I would have expected that in these situations that there's some sort of governance interface or some sort of communication reporting requirement through to, in the context of this happening, through to Chair of Audit and Risk or the Mayor, to have some knowledge input into the various scenario that was unravelling or arising as a result of someone relying on the policy here being activated. So I sort of had this, what's an organisational policy versus council policy? Then I was surprised that there was no governance interface into this policy, and I'd like to see that in there, albeit I'm not sure we can do that because we're just noting it, it's already done. And the third question that I had, if I can, is how often has this policy been used? I'd be interested to know if it's actually been activated, because it's quite a concerning policy if it is activated, in my view. Anyway, 3 questions.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. Over to you, Nikki.
Through the chair, I mean, in terms of that governance interface, my understanding that would be between the up to the chief executive as to whether or not this is discussed with the mayor. I mean, this is really about employees raising concerns, and then, as appropriate, it would be raised with the governance level, depending on, and that's around risk, isn't it? It all comes back to risk, to the body, and that would be assessed at the time.
Just to clarify, if we in our risk policy that we've just discussed with Mr. Vaughan have some, we look at that table 3 and that has that interface there with the governance of the organisation, then this policy will fit in underneath that, and if it's comes up into one of those red areas, then that will activate the interface with governance.
Through the chair, that's how I would see it working, is that depending on the risk of what's been raised, then it would fall within that risk management framework as to how it was escalated up through the organisation and, through to the governance. I'm not aware of this ever being activated. It's a policy that we have in place. It's available to all staff, so they're aware of how they can escalate things, and I'm not aware of it being triggered.
Thank you, Ms. Harrison. Any other, Madam Mayor?
So just help me work through this. So essentially, you've got a system in place for protected disclosures. You identify who somebody should make a protected disclosure to, but if they felt that one of those people were involved in the matter, then they've got an alternate option. And I'm looking through the policy, I just want to understand, so in the event that the chief executive may be involved, walk me through what happens then.
Through the chair, under section,
I understand what the Act says, so the Act tells you that you can go in, but just in terms of this policy.
that would go to one of the other disclosure officers.
So do you really think it's realistic? See, I'm interested in this one because I have to say that we through the chief, I've just got to think about this as to where we deal with a matter in public or public excluded in another committee. And I would have to, no, you wouldn't know. I'm just interested in the concept of if you're concerned around, always an example. So in this organisation, there's been a system called Report It Now. So Report It Now for if you're concerned about workplace bullying, etc., etc. So that's existed. I'm just conscious of the systems in here. That if what you're saying is that, you know, we're doing a hypothetical here, but let's say that somebody's, you know, going, crikey, really concerned, about some very senior staff member in the organisation, are people realistically going to go and report to someone who's on that same tier? Are they really going to do that? I'm just wondering how, you know, if there was an issue, that you actually have got a system where someone would confidently step forward to do a protected disclosure. And I don't know what goes on in other organisations. I'm sorry, I haven't had time to sort of look at this to say, is this consistent with what we have across all councils? Is this standard practice?
And to extrapolate that a little bit further, hypothetically, if someone rang me up and said, oh, I'm concerned about ABC doing X, Y, Z. Now, I'm not a person under this policy, but does that give them the protection under the policy? But they're talking to me because I'm a member of Audit and Risk in my position.
Just while Ms. Harrison's thinking about that, I'm in the position of having been involved in this on the front line on a number of occasions, given the nature of my previous roles, including one where it actually was against the chief executive. I have to record here, I wasn't the chief executive at the time. I was the relieving chief executive who came in subsequent to it, but was made aware of the circumstances. One of the things that I won't go into too much detail about that, but one of the things that strikes me around that was that was a disclosure by a staff member to one of the other managers who was responsible in this, and I subsequently discovered in discussion with the chair, they felt more comfortable talking to that person as a colleague than they did going to governance when the chief executive was involved. So I think that's probably the right route, and the only time I've ever known it, that has been the route, and it worked. So you know, in answer to your question, Madam Mayor, is it realistic? I've seen one example where it was. I read through this with that hat on of having disclosures made because as it says, it can go to chief executive, and I've been receiving a chief executive on this on 3 occasions that I can recall. The system worked in terms of that escalation. The point that you made, Mr. Murray, you then, as I understand it, have an obligation, if somebody raises that with you and you are not one of the members, to encourage that person to raise it with one of the named people. I think you run the risk of breaking confidentiality if you raise it on their behalf, is as I understand it. The hardest thing in my experience with this has been maintaining the confidentiality around it, and that is just purely relating to people behavior. And it can sometimes become evident or there's a suspicion of who that person is. A policy can't cover that, but those have been my experiences around this. in reading this with those hats on, I couldn't think of anything that wasn't covered. It didn't surprise me as the disclosure policies are very, very much of a muchness, and they're very largely dictated by legislation. So I hadn't got any comments on it. But Ms. Harrison, you might like to now respond to some of those questions, perhaps.
Through the chair, I mean, my understanding of disclosure officers is that they're really there to provide guidance as to the appropriate course of action, and to ensure that they will also provide guidance around what to do next, and you know, there's always the option of you know, contacting the Ombudsman and many other places, but it is, yes, it is probably within an organisation, and they can contact the chief executive or any other group manager, but it really is about having certain officers within the organisation that provide the framework and guidance to those staff to ensure that their rights are protected, and with any disclosure that's made.
Thank you, Ms. Harrison. Any further comments, discussion on this? Councillor Delberg.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I made a note here, it's if the employee leaves, just, you know, because it's kind of unbearable or whatever, does this policy sort of cover them as when they've left, or is this just for internal?
My understanding is the legislation is permanent.
Yeah.
So we've got a policy, but the government...
But they're covered by
policy
legislation
covered by-
as well. There is a Protected Disclosures Act, and that covers people who have been subject to protected disclosure activity.
So
Mr.
back to I suppose my initial question is, should this be a council policy as opposed to an organisational policy? Because it is a very important sort of framework, I would have thought.
Happy to take advice on that. Other organisations I've known, it has always been at council level, because it can involve councillors and they need to be aware of what the policy, well, I say council, governance, sorry, being involved at governance level because it can involve them. So I would expect that it would be one they should be aware of, and the best way of making them aware of it is by submitting it to them. Thank you, Steph. Welcome to the table. Asking you to comment on that particular issue which has been raised.
So I understand the question to be, should the policy be an organisational one or a governance policy? Is that correct? Look, I'm not sure that I can clearly answer the question. It's been an organisational policy here historically. I am familiar with it being an organisational policy in other contexts I've worked in. It is focused primarily around protecting employees, the whistleblowing legislation. So my understanding is, well, I guess my personal view is, and it's not a legal opinion, clearly, is that because it's around providing protection for employees to raise issues of corrupt and unethical behaviour, that it makes sense from my perspective to be an organisational policy.
My only comment on that is that you could actually, in many senses, say the same thing about health and safety or risk management, in the sense that the work is undertaken by officers, by staff, by management, by employees, but it still has some level of interest and involvement with by governance. It's an esoteric thing that I'm sure we could debate the pros and cons of, but I'll ask the committee if they would like any further exploration done or anything brought back in that regard, whether as to whether this should be that policy or how you would like to leave this. Madam Mayor?
Chair, I think there's a few things in this I would look at. First question I have is, is this part of I'll come up to the question of where it goes to governance. how are employees made aware of this policy? Is it part of the formal induction? I presume that it is.
Yes, it is.
All right, so people within this organisation, if we were to do a bit of a on the spot test to go, yes, I know what their protected disclosures policy is.
I would be confident that someone who is a relatively recent appointee to the organisation would be aware of it. Thank you. I don't believe we have offered training while I've been in the organisation on the policy itself, so we haven't rolled it out to existing employees in the 12 months that I've been in the organisation. It's provided as a written document to employees during their induction process.
All right, so that will be one thing that I'd say if we're going to have a policy and it's managed to make it all the way to an agenda to get to a council table or a committee meeting, that might be a good part of it, when we receive policies in, this is a bit of an action step that happens from that to make sure the organisation is, aware of it and across it. The other part of it is just this issue of, protected disclosures applies to elected members as well. I was just trying to drag up our code of conduct document to see whether it's in there. I'm pretty sure it is. So certainly we are covered by this legislation, and so there's mechanisms by which you could undertake protected disclosure, and I imagine it is sitting in our code of conduct policy, and one of the officers may be able to tell me that, because I'm just wondering whether we're dealing with one piece of legislation that gets applied in different ways. I don't recall anything of this degree of outline that has been put in front of me as a governance member as to what I would do. But I'd have to just dig around very quickly on my iPad to try and find the code of conduct policy. So the question I have is this one of these things where, is this whole of organisation, or is this actually specific to employees? I think my understanding is no, that it actually applies to if there is an issue and you're a member of governance, you've got an ability to use the protected disclosures legislation. Therefore, I kind of work out where does it actually sit, and should we be using the same method, or does the legislation provide for different methods for governance versus employees? And I don't know the answers to those questions, but that might help us.
If I may, one possibility is for if you would like some information, if the committee would like some information on what other local government organisations do, I do have the ability to reach out to my colleagues in other organisations and conduct a bit of a straw poll. If that doesn't go far enough, of course we could seek more expert advice, legal advice.
So some guidance here. I mean, the other thing is to check whether it does appear in the code of conduct. It does. So if it's in the code of conduct, it does encompass governance, and if it's referred to within that. So it then becomes a question of what this committee could recommend to council, or councillors could recommend to council in relation to this policy.
My understanding of it is that this
And I have to say I can understand that, Sam, but it probably begs the question then about whether there should be anything that talks about, while that one covers staff, what is the one that covers governance, given that there is a reference in the Code of Conduct to governance, which governance is bound by. So it may well be that the committee could ask for some clarification or a further report on what is how governance is affected by or covered by such a policy. But Madam Mayor.
Look, I'm just having a look at the Code of Conduct, which is under review at the moment, so I'm not sure if it's going to be in the new one. Councillor Delby might have a better idea about that because he's leading that piece of work. But if I'm reading this very quickly and correctly, under the Act, the definition of an employee of a public sector organisation, a PSO, includes elected members of a local authority, and the policy goes on to tell us, so I'm learning something today, that the Act requires disclosure by an employee, so that therefore means elected members, if I'm reading this right, and I'm a gentleman who may know a bit more about this, and then requires it to follow the internal procedures of the PSO. Council is required to establish internal procedures to address the receipt of and dealing with information about serious wrongdoing in the council, which is assumedly this policy, which, if I'm reading this correctly, means that under the Code of Conduct for elected members are also required to follow this policy. Well, I would be reasonably confident that the elected members wouldn't know that or be familiar with this policy.
And what I heard was council was required to establish procedures, which clearly they have, so therefore my take on that is this policy needs to be a council policy, not an organisational one, because council is required to establish. Yeah. Don't we have to move resolution to get it on the status report?
Could we move that it lies on the table to, if we move it to lie on the table, awaiting further advice from the Chief Executive? Will that do the job, Linda? I'm not sure if that's satisfactory. You might have some better wording than that, Mr. Chair, through you.
Mr. Chair. Yeah, there's the comment there about is this in the Code of Conduct, the new version. There's some bits on information and confidential information. Information received, the capacity as elected member, but I don't actually see a motion there about protected disclosure policy. So it may be something that we need to
It might be worth looking
address.
at that in the new
I have
Code
made a
of
wee
Conduct.
note and I'll try and do something with that.
Okay.
Thank
So
you.
do I need a motion to leave it on the table? Can I be guided? Thank you. Would somebody please move that this be left on the table until such time as the Chief Executive is in a position to report further on it?
Happy to move.
Thank you,
Move.
Madam Mayor. Seconded by Councillor Dolberg. Thank you. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. We move to item 16, Trafalgar Park seating and the sale of the Punawai. Welcome to the table, Mr. Ward. Over to any updates or just introduce the report?
So there are no updates to the report. I'll take it as read and happy to answer any questions on it.
So, questions for the officers in relation to both the Trafalgar Park seating and the sale of the Punawai? Mr. Murray?
Thank you. Just a question about process. I can recall being at the meeting where Mr. Cross came and raised these issues, and I can't quite recall what the exact issues were. But having said that, we've had a look at it, we've investigated it, we've come to some conclusions, and presumably we pass these resolutions to receive, note and note. What happens, is there any communication back to Mr. Cross about our findings and our outcomes, or does it sort of stop once that gets to council with those recommendations and resolutions? Just about process, really.
Through the chair, I'm happy to follow up with Mr. Cross in terms of what's happened at this meeting.
Ms. Bishop?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have already responded to Mr. Cross because it was a Lagoima matter, and we initially refused to supply the information, it being considered vexatious because it was about his 6th, 7th, 8th query on the matter. And we reviewed that decision in light of some information we received from the Ombudsman, and basically reversed that decision, so we did provide the information in the end.
Okay, so presumably that's about providing information, whereas we've sort of looked at information, assessed it, and made some conclusions. And I suppose it's one thing just giving them some documents or some information, but it's another thing when you're in that judgment space and making decisions. So that it was really just, are we communicating that bit to them as well?
And I'm happy to undertake, following this meeting, to whatever the committee decides to convey that to.
Thank you, Mr. Ward. Councillor Delberg?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. The analysis, I suppose, or the report on the Trafalgar Park seating, read that and I feel comfortable with that. I don't know how anyone else feels about it. Then it's just the sale of the boat. Just a couple of questions about that. I don't know how you want to address that.
Please go ahead on either points, raise questions with the officers. Thank you.
I'd actually say the one on the park seating, for all I'm reading, is I thought we did that extremely well. The council did that extremely well, and the numbers seem to show we got a very good arrangement there. The sale there seems to be around the changing the process about the private sale, and that it was an exception to the asset deposit policy. So my question would be why. I couldn't quite get that, knowing that we could do it, but I couldn't quite get why we changed it. So I could probably start with that question first.
Mr. Ward, are you in a position to respond to that, or Ms. Bishop? Thank you.
Through the chair, a report was put up to council to recommend that we go through a private sale because an offer had been received, and advice from people in the knowledge of the industry about selling vessels, that actually through the auction process it was unlikely to achieve as good a result as having a offer already on the table that was within the valuations that we received for the vessel. It was within both valuations we had received. So the advice given was by delaying the process, I guess, and going through a auction process, that it could jeopardise the offer that we already had, and it was recommended to the council that we proceed with a private sale, noting it was against the policy that was in place. And I guess it's one, things move on so quickly in the real world compared to what our policies say, and the way transactions are made these days, the older method, I guess, if you like, of a public auction is probably not one that happens very often these days.
So,
Councillor Dolly.
So again, I wasn't on the council at the time, but so I went to the council, they come back and approved a change from what we normally do. So that was signed off, that's good.
That's correct.
My next question then, probably, they made a comment about the second motor, and that seemed to be, and I'm seeing here we've signed that off nicely as it was basically a standard practice for safety equipment. That ties that up nicely for me. The next one there, 3.5. I've got a note here, what does it mean? A legal review of the purchase agreement. So that paragraph, what exactly are we saying there?
So, through the chair, when we received the offer for sale, it was using a standard template obtained from a marine broker's office. That was looked over by our legal officer within council, as well as we had an external legal review of the sale document and also the purchase document for the replacement vessel. I think it's fair to say more attention was given to the purchase document than the offer to purchase our existing boat.
And sorry, through Mr. Chair. So between all that, then that then gave you the departure from the policy on this occasion. That gave you confident we were doing the right thing.
Through the chair, yes, I was satisfied that with those checks and approvals in place, the best outcome was obtained for the council's money.
So it looks to me it was more like we kind of didn't look like the process of right from someone external, but internally it looks like we have done the bit. I'll leave the other members to ask more questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Delberg. Any further questions from members of the subcommittee or other attending councillors? Welcome to Councillor Matheson, by the way. But, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just on the Punawai, I just wanted to just track this through. So what I'm looking at is the report today, and the rationale at 3.6 on page 133 is that the council agreed to depart from the policy on this occasion to ensure the outcome maximised value for money for the council. So what I'm looking for is something that demonstrates to me in the reporting that council can show that it maximised value for money for council. And I'm actually not finding that very easy to find at the moment. So I'm just wondering if the officers could just talk me through that. I understand the issue of going to public auction, or the auction issue, but the question here is whether we would, was auction the method, or could we have gone to advertising it for sale publicly?
So through the chair, the original report to council had the benefits and disbenefits of the variety of options, and the option of the private sale was recommended. I believe the original report is also included as a appendix to this report. So yes, it was about timing, but it was also acknowledged there were, I guess, a limited audience that would be interested in this kind of purchase. So while we had a good offer on the table, it was considered important not to lose that.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I would say, just in terms of when we deal with these matters, and I'm sorry, I should have raised this before the meeting, if you're a member of the public and you're trying to understand, so here's someone who's come to public forum, raised an issue, and this is here so that we can respond to that public forum matter. It is quite challenging to actually understand council's decision making. A, if you don't get the attachments to the reports, and there may be a reason why, you know, you really do need to know, and it may be there for some reasons we didn't attach the agreement for purchase of the Punawai or the valuation. That may be why, but I think it's quite tricky to follow what we're doing unless you've got the attachments. And the second thing I would say is it's actually quite tricky to follow unless you've got the minutes, because my recollection of this is that second valuation, that there was one valuation, and that as a result of the meeting, what the recommendation was, and I hope I'm right about this, what was recommended wasn't resolved. Something else was resolved, which I think either, not on the resolution, or separately, a second valuation was requested by council to ensure that we had tested the market. But I'm sorry, without me going and hauling through trying to find documents, and the officers may be able to just sequence this for me. Because I think at the point it came to council for the first time, or at some point, or there was some discussion, we had a valuation, but we didn't have two valuations.
Through the chair, yes, the mayor's memory is correct in a sense. When the report went to the Planning and Reg Committee, there was one valuation, and we hadn't received the second valuation at that time, but it had been requested, and we received it in time for the report going to the council meeting.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Did you want any further?
No, I wouldn't,
action?
but I would just note that when we're bringing these matters forward, particularly off the back of, we're a member of the public has brought forward, to understand what council does, you need both the reports and the minutes. And ideally you need the attachments as well, if you can put them there, so that you can really see the sequence, because it's not easy, and I know that myself, and I've gone back to try and track what committees have been doing. Unless I've got both the reports and the minutes, it's quite hard to follow.
So we ask, I'm sure officers have taken note of that. Thank you. Any further questions? The recommendations are that the subcommittee receives the report on covering both. We note the purchase of the Trafalgar Park seating, and we note that council approved the private sale of the Punawai for reasons covered. Do I have anybody prepared to move that motion, please? Councillor Delberg, thank you. Seconded. Mr. Murray, thank you. Any further discussion? If not, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you, Mr. Ward. Thank you, Ms. Bishop. And we move to the final item on the agenda, after which we will close the meeting. We've got public excluded, but I'd like to try and get through this before we break for lunch. I'd like to try and get through the meeting, so we'll move to item 17, interim audit letter, and invite Bede Kearney. Nice to see you here again, Bede, so welcome. And ask you to introduce your report with any updates, anything that may be necessary.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. This is the interim report. It represents our findings from the initial audit visit that we've done. Purpose of that visit is really to review council systems, design and operation of them. It's for our purposes to determine the extent that we can rely on them as part of our testing. If we can rely on the systems, our audit becomes more efficient. We also look more broadly at some other aspects of the control environment, and around things like project management and conflicts of interest policies and the like. So our findings are in there, and I won't talk to the detail of them at this point. We also refer there is another report. We produced two reports. One issues that we bring to this forum, and then there's another one that goes to management. It's our judgment in terms of the level of significance, I suppose, of the findings. I understand that the chair has been briefed on the content of that report, so this is the report that I'm speaking to at the moment. So happy to take any questions, comments. I do note that in the covering note that Nikki's prepared, I guess they're the responses that will be incorporated into the final version of this document.
Thank you, Mr. Kearney. And yeah, I mean, just for members' information, I have gone through that management letter with the group manager, corporate services, and can confirm I didn't see anything on there that needed to be at a higher level than in the management letter. So open for questions. Any questions from members? Mr. Murray.
Perhaps a comment about that particular comment you've just made. I suppose one of the observations from working within council is sometimes you see different things from different perspectives, and A and B equals C, and you match up with D. And while I appreciate you've had a look at all of that stuff, that's good, and I'm comfortable with that. But I just wonder if in the front end of this report we could have something along those lines that you've had a look through and there's no issues in the report itself, so that I know that that's happened. And or I was even going to go to an extent of actually just summarising, you know, the headings of whatever it was, because quite honestly, it just leaves me in a vacuum that there's another letter out there, albeit I'm hearing it's not significant. It just leaves that question unanswered in my mind. That's all.
Totally accept that, Mr. Murray, and I must admit it is something that, I mean, when I first came onto this committee, there was a sort of approach of not being allowed to see that letter at all, and I think we did set a precedent that I would be in a position to discuss it with the Chief Executive, which is what has happened in the past. But given the change in personnel, it was picked up between Ms. Harrison and myself. But I think you make a valid point. I'm quite keen for that to take as wider coverage as possible, and recognising it is while it's a letter between audit and management, it is something that I think is of interest. Or there could be items on there that are of interest to this group. So we'll take that on board, Mr. Murray. Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Kearney or for Ms. Harrison, who's the author of the report? If not, would somebody be in a position to move, please, that the subcommittee receives the interim audit letter and notes the suggested responses to the recommendations? Thank you, Councillor Delberg. Do I have a seconder for that? Mr. Murray, thank you. Any further discussion? If not, all those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. That brings us to the end of the public meeting. Would somebody please move that the motion that we exclude the public for the reasons stated in the agenda? Thank you, Madam Mayor. Have a seconder for that? Councillor Delberg, thank you. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Kearney to stay for this. Could we have a resolution that Mr. Kearney remain for the public excluded meeting? I have a mover from John Murray. I'm happy to second that. Is everybody comfortable with that? Those in favour, please say aye. Second. And the reason you want? Yeah.
Could I just point of clarification, Linda? Are we online or offline, please? We're still in public. Oh, we need to resolve that we're going to go into public excluded.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought
We need to resolve that Mr. Kearney can stay in public. So we're just looking for the right motion to put at the moment. Can we adjourn briefly, please? record. And the reason is, as the external auditor, to seek Mr. Kearney's input onto our bad debt situation. So, happy to have those. All those in favour, please say aye.
Well,
Say again, sorry.
apologies. Mr. Chair, just in relation to the reason, so the reason, sorry, apologies to interrupt, the reason is in relation to, I'm just trying to get the agendas to line up. So the item number is, it's in relation
Item number
to
3.
Item number 3, which is, wrong report, which refers to our management of our bad debt. Would that be what it's called? Yes, something along those lines. Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you.
Relative, yes, thank you.
That's what we're seeking. So, we're clear on that? All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Mr. Murray had moved, I had seconded. You had moved that, I had seconded. Thank you. In that case, I declare the public meeting closed, and we'll go to public excluded. Thank you.